Chapter 1087. It was quiet in the luxury suite of the hotel. But Qin Weibai's mood was always up and down. All kinds of emotions were brewing in her heart, making her feel complicated. She was a little worried, but not like it. She was happy, but not like it. She was anxious, but not like it. She was looking forward to it, but not like it. Her body was still soft after being tossed and turned all night. That kind of extreme joy and satisfaction slowly dissipated, replaced by obvious sleepiness. All kinds of emotions kept emerging, seeming right but not right, making Qin Weibai feel a little confused. She felt as if something was going to happen, but she didn't know what it was. During this period, she seemed to think of something. She put on her clothes and went downstairs with a blush on her face. She bought something from a nearby pharmacy and came back to try it, confirming that she was not pregnant. That was to say, her current mood had little to do with Li Tianlan's love for her day and night in the past month or so. But this kind of uneasy mood had a lot to do with Li Tianlan. Qin Weibai didn't tell anyone. She had never dreamed of Li Tianlan in her dreams since she was a child. This statement was not very exact, but it could be said to be accurate. In the trance, she had dreamed of many scenes related to Li Tianlan, but that feeling made Qin Weibai feel like she was watching a movie about the past. In those dreams, there was Li Tianlan. But it was not Li Tianlan in reality. Li Tianlan's figure in the dream had always been vague. Even if he appeared beside her in the dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow, an erratic shadow. In Qin Weibai's dream, Li Tianlan's clothes, face, and temperament changed thousands of times every second. The changes were so drastic that in Qin Weibai's consciousness, Li Tianlan in the dream had no facial features, and he was even a shadow without a body. But every time she saw that shadow, Qin Weibai's consciousness in the dream would tell her that it was Li Tianlan. She in the dream also believed it. She and the master of Samsara Palace, who was in Warefree Heights now, were really the same person. They had the same consciousness, the same habits, and the same thoughts. At a short distance, the two of them could share the hurt with each other or bear it alone. At a distance, their thoughts were completely synchronized. Both of them knew what the other was thinking all the time because it was their own thoughts. At a further distance, their dreams were completely synchronized. To be exact, when the master of Samsara Palace was in the southern hemisphere, and Qin Weibai was in the northern hemisphere, when they were resting at the same time, their dreams were completely identical. Therefore, for the current Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan was a ghost that had been lingering in her consciousness since she was a child. She kept synchronizing with the master of Samsara Palace and eventually became the same person. They had the same thoughts, so naturally, they had the same feelings. Therefore, there was no obstacle for her to accept Li Tianlan. But she had always been confused. She loved him so much and was willing to give everything for him. But why was Li Tianlan just a shadow in her dream? More than 2 years ago, after the Eternal Sword of Mormons, the shadow that belonged to Li Tianlan, which was constantly changing every moment, began to appear more and more in Qin Weibai's dreams. Qin Weibai knew what was going on. This was the master of Samsara Palace's entrustment. In the past, Qin Weibai would also dream, but the source of Li Tianlan in her dreams was the master of Samsara Palace. Now the illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan frequently appeared in her dreams because, in a sense, the other Li Tianlan was already dead. She might not be completely dead, but she was definitely not alive in her current state. So Li Tianlan began to appear suddenly in her dreams. He appeared more and more often, but the shadow became more and more blurred. The master of Samsara Palace broke through the transcendent realm in the spiritual field in the Eternal Sword. Now, Qin Weibai was improving every moment. There was no obstacle for her to enter the so-called transcendent realm. Before she went to the desert prison, she had been close to the so-called extreme realm in the spiritual field. Therefore, she consciously built a garden in her dream. A garden where sunlight and flying snow danced together. That was her most hidden territory and the starting point of all her dreams. Qin Weibai's only regret was that there was no Li Tianlan in that garden. She even thought more than once that if she could completely connect her consciousness with Li Tianlan's and form a certain degree of thinking synchronization, then in her dreams, could she also bring Li Tianlan into that garden and let their dreams be completely connected? In this way, even if she was not by his side in the future, she could see him in her dreams. It was not him in her imagination, but the real consciousness of Li Tianlan in her dreams. If she let him bully her in her dreams, she would not let him be so gluttonous and unrestrained as he was now. She really thought about this problem seriously. Then she saw Li Tianlan in her dreams. Li Tianlan in his youth. The ancient tree, the wind and snow, the dense sword marks, the boy, and the wooden sword were not things in Qin Weibai's dreams. There was only the garden in her dream, which was the source of the dream. In the source, if Qin Weibai didn't want her dream to expand freely, she could make herself stay in the garden and see nothing out of the control of her spirit. But in such a state, she actually saw Li Tianlan. This was obviously an unusual scene. But why would such a situation occur? The teenager Li Tianlan in the dream was extremely clear and real, just like the child who really lived in Qin Weibai's dream. Qin Weibai woke up at that moment. But when she woke up, she still felt that the child was still living in the snow beside the garden. The ancient tree had collapsed, but he seemed to know nothing and still sat there quietly. That feeling was unparalleled. Qin Weibai could be sure that it was not Li Tianlan constructed by her consciousness. The Li Tianlan she constructed with her consciousness was just a faint shadow. He was not a teenager, and even his figure was extremely vague. And not to mention that she had not reached the transcendent realm. Even if she had really entered the transcendent realm, she could not merge her consciousness with Li Tianlan's to form synchronization in the dream. This kind of thing, according to Qin Weibai's understanding, could only exist in fantasy, and it was just fantasy. So who was the teenager in her dream? Qin Weibai was a little uneasy. She carefully recalled the garden in the dream. The flowers were bright, the sun was bright, and the snow was cold. The teenager outside the garden was quiet and plain. It was a very beautiful picture, but it was so beautiful that it was not lively at all. Qin Weibai suddenly felt an indescribable sense of strangeness and horror. It was normal for her to recall every scene in the dream. But the more she thought about it, the weirder she felt. That kind of deeply hidden weirdness was originally completely hidden, but with the appearance of the young Li Tianlan, all the abnormalities were revealed little by little. Qin Weibai sat on the bed and wrapped herself in the quilt. The flying snow crossed the sky through the opened curtains. Without Li Tianlan, the bedroom suddenly became very cold. She sat quietly like this. She didn't eat at noon. As time went by, she became more and more sleepy and began to struggle with her eyelids, but she always forced herself to hold on. At the thought of the teenager Li Tianlan in the dream, she felt a little scared and even dared not sleep. However, the extreme mental fatigue caused her consciousness to become deeper and deeper, deeper and deeper. Qin Weibai's body slid from the sitting position little by little. She lay down again and fell asleep again in a daze. It was still the bright and colorful garden. But the sunshine in the sky disappeared. The snowflakes were scattered and dancing. Qin Weibai stood where she was, feeling the gloomy sky in the dream, and understood that it was because she was too tired now. The flowers in the garden swayed slightly in the wind and snow. Qin Weibai stood stiffly in the garden in the dream, looking straight ahead. She even dared not turn her head. From her position, as long as she turned right, she could see the gate of the garden. If the teenager was still there, she might see the teenager Li Tianlan first. Qin Weibai on the bed breathed unsteadily and frowned. In the dream, she was already extremely nervous. The wind and snow in the air seemed to be much fiercer. In the dream, Qin Weibai clearly felt the cold. She kept taking deep breaths several times before she controlled herself to slowly turn her head. The first thing that came into her sight was not the gate of the garden, nor the teenager Li Tianlan outside the gate. Instead, it was a thick and old tree that blocked out the sky and the sun but was completely black. The dark giant tree stood outside the gate of the garden. In the wind and snow, the trunk, the treetop, the leaves, everything was quiet and almost dead, without the slightest tremor. Qin Weibai's body was cold, and her heart kept sinking. It seemed to be the giant tree that she had seen before that had collapsed. However, when he entered the dream for the second time, the tree had returned to its original appearance. No, it seemed that many years had passed in the dream. Not only did the tree return to its original appearance, but it had also become even stronger. The entire tree had also begun to turn dark and deathly still. There was no teenager under the tree, no wooden sword. There was emptiness. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief. The moment her nervous mood relaxed, she suddenly froze again and looked carefully at the giant tree. Countless snowflakes fell under the crown of the giant tree, but the distribution of the snowflakes was somewhat different. There was a small area where the snowflakes seemed to be floating quietly. It seemed that there was something invisible there that supported the snowflakes and did not let them fall. Qin Weibai looked at it quietly. She looked for a long time before she finally confirmed that there seemed to be an illusory figure that had almost completely become nothingness there. He stayed there indifferently. If she did not look carefully, she could not find him at all. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. She knew that she dreamed of Li Tianlan again. In the case of extreme mental exhaustion, the control of the source of the garden was loosened. She dreamed of Li Tianlan at the source of the dream. The Li Tianlan in her dream was this shadow, which was changing every second and was almost transparent. After all, it was something in her consciousness. The coldness in Qin Weibai's heart slowly dissipated. She walked over briskly. In her dream, the Li Tianlan in her dream could do a lot of things. But this time, the illusory shadow that seemed like it would dissipate at any moment did nothing. He sat quietly under the tree, as if he was extremely tired and resting, but also as if he was thinking about something. His posture looked a little strange. Qin Weibai looked for a long time before she realized that the shadow's body was a little tilted. This posture seemed to be held in someone's arms. Qin Weibai looked at it carefully. It meant that there was nothing next to the illusory shadow of Li Tianlan. Beside him, there was only the dark giant tree. The dark tree was far thicker than what she saw in the garden. But as Qin Weibai walked closer, the state of the giant tree became clear in her eyes. The giant tree in front of her seemed to be torn apart as well. At this time, there were pieces of metal fragments of different colors inserted in the trunk of the giant tree. Qin Weibai couldn't recognize what kind of metal they were, but she could vaguely feel the color of the metal fragments. However, the originally colorful metal fragments were all dim at this time. Dense cracks spread on each fragment, which was shocking. The cracks spread from the roots to countless branches. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even more pieces of metal were densely packed together. The black giant tree was completely torn by the metal fragments. The giant tree was trembling slightly, and the dark and lusterless sap slowly flowed down from the trunk, like pieces of black blood. Qin Weibai's brows were tightly knitted together. The illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan was still sitting there, as if it would dissipate at any time, but it never did. Qin Weibai stopped in front of the shadow and looked at the giant tree behind him. The giant tree trembled more and more obviously, and the black blood seemed to have flowed into a small waterfall. She didn't know why, but Qin Weibai suddenly felt that the tree should be much bigger than what she had seen. The source of her dream was limited, so the tree seemed to have shrunk many times. It was a very natural feeling. She felt that if the tree really existed, it would be almost infinitely tall, and every piece of metal fragment inserted in the trunk would probably be big enough to cover the whole sky. The tree and the fragments were infinitely shrunk. Only the size of the shadow was ordinary. Black blood flowed down from the trunk, as if to completely drown the shadow. However, a powerful aura blocked all the black liquid outside. It seemed to be a sword energy. Qin Weibai was a little confused. When she walked out of the garden, the dream had already unfolded from the source. She didn't know why she had such a dream. The giant black tree was very close to her. Qin Weibai could clearly feel countless emotions from the patches of black blood. Bloody, cruel, evil, chaotic, violent, resentful. Dark and gloomy. The metal fragments inserted in the trunk reflected a faint light. The light was absolutely cold, with an absolutely complete and perfect law, forming a natural sense of repulsion. Qin Weibai really didn't dare to move for a moment. She suddenly found that whether she was close to the black giant tree or those metal fragments, she would end up horribly. She was only the safest when she was around the shadow. But the shadow itself was the most illusory. Tianlan, in the dream, Qin Weibai called softly. The shadow was silent, motionless, and didn't respond at all. This was different from her usual dreams. Qin Weibai thought about it and did what she used to do in her dreams. This was her dream. Everything in front of her was a continuation of her consciousness. She had absolute authority here. In her dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow that was constantly changing every minute and second. Qin Weibai would try to focus her attention and her consciousness every time to make Li Tianlan become clear. Such an attempt had never succeeded. But she would keep trying until she woke up naturally. Qin Weibai gently sat next to the shadow and looked at it seriously. She began to concentrate her attention and focus her consciousness. The dream began to shake unstably. This was a sign that she was about to wake up after doing something deliberately in the dream. Qin Weibai looked at the shadow in front of her calmly. The shadow began to become clear in her constant concentration. A shallow, faint outline appeared in the almost transparent shadow. The outline began to have slight edges. A touch of color gradually appeared in her sight. It was purple. The moment the purple color appeared, it began to change into various complex colors. Qin Weibai had long been used to this change. However, this change only appeared for a few seconds today, and then it was completely fixed. The constantly changing color disappeared. A shocking black and red color appeared in front of Qin Weibai. No, it was not black and red. It was a black windbreaker. However, the windbreaker was stained with large patches of blood. The blood was almost smeared on every corner of the black windbreaker, which looked sad and tragic. The smell of blood began to appear in the dream. The black windbreaker with a corner stained with blood became completely clear and did not change. It did not change. Qin Weibai's heart began to sink like crazy, as if falling into an ice cave. Because this time, Li Tianlan's body was also fixed and did not change. More and more black windbreakers began to appear. The bloodstains spread all the way down. But what Qin Weibai saw was only a black windbreaker. In the dream, she did not see Li Tianlan's leg. It seemed to be cut by an extremely sharp weapon. One of Li Tianlan's leg had completely disappeared. The wound seemed to have happened not long ago. Hot blood was flowing from the wound, and the hem of the windbreaker was almost completely soaked in blood. The shadow became clearer and clearer. Qin Weibai saw Li Tianlan's other leg. No, it was the other half of the leg. His calf also disappeared, and so did his knee. Ghastly white bones and blood spread from his thigh. The surrounding air suddenly became hot and boiling. Li Tianlan's sleeve appeared. The empty sleeve was dancing feebly, and blood slowly dripped down from the cuff. His other hand still looked good, but the skin of that arm had turned bluish-gray. Dense metal fragments were stuck in every corner of his arm, tearing his finger joints and tearing his muscles and blood vessels. It was a bloody arm, as if someone had fired thousands of bullets directly at the arm at the same time. The heart-wrenching pain broke out from Qin Weibai's consciousness in an instant. She saw most of Li Tianlan's body. She saw his chest and abdomen. The black windbreaker on his chest and abdomen had long been broken, and dense wounds crisscrossed his chest and abdomen. The blood and white bones stimulated Qin Weibai's nerves wildly. On his chest, Li Tianlan's left and right atriums were completely empty. His two hearts had been taken out, and only blood was still flowing. Qin Weibai's body trembled violently. She had tried countless times to make the shadow that represented Li Tianlan become clear, but she never expected that the shadow would be in such a state after it became clear. It was a nightmare that she didn't want to recall in any case. She trembled and raised her head. At this moment, the shadow became completely real. She saw the shadow's head. That was Li Tianlan's head. This shadow was indeed Li Tianlan. One of Li Tianlan's eye sockets was empty and dark. The blood seemed to have completely solidified the moment the eyeball was taken out, and there was another shocking wound between his eyebrows. It seemed to be a fingerprint. It was this fingerprint that pressed between Li Tianlan's eyebrows, penetrated his brain completely in an instant, and cut off all his vitality. Qin Weibai almost suffocated. It was really Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's corpse. No, to be precise, it should be Li Tianlan's mutilated corpse. It was not even a complete corpse. This corpse, which seemed to have just died or fallen for countless years, sat there quietly. His face was covered with blood, but with a strange calmness and exhaustion. The moment this figure appeared, the giant black tree and the endless metal fragments behind him became completely quiet. The black blood disappeared, the giant tree was no longer shaking, and the metal fragments were no longer reflecting light. All the auras also disappeared, as if all of them had become dormant and chosen to retreat. The mutilated corpse still sat quietly, not looking at Qin Weibai, just quietly looking at the distance in the dream. The world was spinning. Qin Weibai screamed out loud. Not in the dream. But in the bedroom. Her body sat up from the bed in an instant, her eyes red, her face covered with tears, and she looked miserable. Why? Her body trembled violently. Why did I have such a dream? It's not a dream. A soft and ethereal voice rang out beside Qin Weibai. It was soft and pleasant, with a sense of intimacy. Qin Weibai was quiet for a moment. She turned her head. A figure shrouded in light sat quietly on the side of the bed, looking at her silently. Qin Weibai couldn't see her face or expression, but she could only be sure that it was a woman. It seemed that her consciousness was still immersed in the dream. She was stunned for a long time, and the first question was not how the other party came in, but asked with a trembling voice, "If it's not a dream, what is it?" "That is His Majesty Li Tianlan." In the light, the woman said softly, "Whether it is the shadow you saw or the mutilated corpse, they are all," after a pause, she said, "they are all his most real state." Chapter 1088. Qin Weibai didn't speak for a long time. A shadow and a mutilated corpse. The most real state. In the halo beside the bed, the voice of the slim figure was clear and sweet. Qin Weibai suddenly felt extremely disgusted and repulsed. Because of the content of that sentence. Li Tianlan's real state. Could it be that the so-called true state was the phantom and the mutilated corpse? She forced herself to calm down and shook her head. "I don't believe it," she said in a cold voice. The halo beside the bed fluctuated softly. She didn't speak. For some reason, at this moment, Qin Weibai suddenly felt that the woman in the halo seemed to want to get close to her, but in the end, she didn't move. The truth is in the dream. Whether you believe it or not, it doesn't change anything. The woman in the halo said softly. She seemed to see the shadow and the mutilated corpse in Qin Weibai's dream. In the slightly swaying halo, Qin Weibai felt a clear pain and sadness. If that is Tianlan's real state, then what is Tianlan now? Qin Weibai stared at the light around her and asked word by word. "That is the reality you see." Qin Weibai sneered. "We see it? Then what about the shadow in my dream?" "It is the reality in the illusion." In the halo, the woman's answer was still gentle and without hesitation. Qin Weibai suddenly felt a little cold. With their questions and answers, the whole world seemed to have unknowingly become gloomy. It was as if there was some kind of danger brewing quietly and slowly. Then, it would erupt bit by bit, bringing with it a deadly murderous intent. Qin Weibai felt a little dizzy. All the cold air in the air seemed to be circling around the ball of light beside the bed, and then she quietly endured it. The scene in front of her seemed a little familiar, and so did the dizziness in her mind. Qin Weibai was stunned and subconsciously said, "This is the malice of the world?" The slightly swaying light paused for a moment. The woman seemed a little surprised, but then she nodded. "Yes. That is to say, you know Xianyuan Wushang?" Qin Weibai asked again. She thought of some information revealed by Xianyuan Wushang. "He said he has a sister." "Is that you?" "No." The woman said softly, "But to a certain extent, I can be considered his older sister. You can also say that I am his younger sister. But now, I am his aunt." Qin Weibai looked at the soft light in silence. For the first time, she realized that her IQ seemed to be a little off. Was she an elder sister, a younger sister, or an aunt? This relationship was absolutely chaotic, but the logic seemed to be very clear. However, from such a relationship, Qin Weibai could not arrange it for a while. "Who are you?" Qin Weibai asked. The woman seemed to be stunned. She was silent for a long time. If she hadn't found out that something had happened to Qin Weibai, she wouldn't have come here now. This kind of meeting made her feel a little nervous. She did not know how to answer Qin Weibai's question. From a certain point of view, Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai were her parents. But from another perspective, they could no longer be considered his parents. "I am Feng Qinggu." After a long period of silence, the woman finally spoke. She only said her name softly. Qin Weibai rubbed her forehead. Just like the first time she met Xianyuan Wushang, Li Tianlan didn't have any hostility but felt close to him. She felt the same closeness to Feng Qinggu now, even more so than Li Tianlan felt for Xianyuan Wushang. "Feng Qinggu," she whispered to herself. "You can call me Qinggu." The voice in the halo murmured, as if it was acting coquettishly. Qin Weibai wanted to laugh, but she was really not in the mood. She rubbed between her eyebrows like Li Tianlan and said softly, "That dream, what's going on?" "It's a real projection projected in your consciousness. Of course, from your point of view now, it's also illusory. But no matter what the situation is, its existence needs to be affirmed." The temperature in the air seemed to be colder, with a bone-chilling coldness. Qin Weibai knew very well that if this was the malice of the world, then the malice now was many times greater than the malice that Xianyuan Wushang and Li Tianlan had suffered. Because at that time, Qin Weibai only felt a little dizzy, but now she clearly felt the changes in the surrounding space. Real. Illusory. These were the two most common words, but now every time she heard them, Qin Weibai's heart would feel cold for no reason. "I don't understand." Qin Weibai hesitated for a moment and said slowly, "Can you give me more details?" "I can't say." Feng Qinggu said softly. "But you can ask, maybe I can answer some." Qin Weibai did not know what to ask. Now all her mind was focused on the mutilated corpse and the illusory shadow in the dream. She did not dare to think about what it represented. Did it represent Li Tianlan's future? As soon as this thought popped up, Qin Weibai felt weak all over. Feng Qinggu seemed to know something, but Qin Weibai didn't dare to believe everything she said. But she didn't dare to disbelieve it either. The only topic she could talk about now seemed to be this. "In that dream, I dreamed of Tianlan." Qin Weibai wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "That is indeed His Majesty, but not the future His Majesty. Although it is not very accurate, if we must describe it, it should be the past His Majesty." Feng Qinggu said. Qin Weibai's heart trembled slightly. Her ability to accept things was obviously not comparable to that of ordinary people. With her other self as a living example, she easily thought of a direction that others did not dare to think of. "You mean, reincarnation and rebirth?" "There is no such thing as reincarnation in this world." Feng Qinggu said slowly, "It's reincarnation, not your Majesty's personal reincarnation, but, Kacha." Feng Qingwu, the voice suddenly disappeared. In Qin Weibai's sight, the empty air suddenly twisted, and a piercing coldness broke out in an instant, turning into an ice wind. Shocking ice layers began to appear in the empty air. Feng Qingwu changed the topic and said softly, "Your understanding is wrong because of the problem of the timeline. But in fact, time has no meaning. What you experience is only your own timeline. When you put time in a wide enough area, you will find that the so-called present may be the future in another area, and the future may be the past in another area. What you see now is only the past relative to your current timeline. But whether it is the present or the future, that scene has happened." Qin Weibai was in a daze. "Why did I dream of this?" she asked softly. "You are waking up, or in other words, another you is waking up, and you have caused a synchronization in a sense." "What is waking up?" Feng Qingwu fell silent again. This was obviously a question she could not answer. "After waking up, will I see that kind of Tianlan? I am also very awake now, and I would rather not wake up like that." Qin Weibai continued. "This is an inevitable process." Feng Qingwu said slowly, "It is irreversible. And from our point of view, we all hope that you can speed up your awakening, even if it is for His Majesty." Qin Weibai looked at her quietly, waiting for her explanation. Feng Qingwu was silent for a while, and said softly, "His Majesty's path has come to an end, and his experience is completely different from that of another you. The current level is already the peak state he can reach. He may be stronger, but it is impossible for him to break through again. Only when you gradually wake up can His Majesty really break through to that supreme realm." Qin Weibai thought for a while, and there was obvious suspicion in her eyes. "Xinyuan Wushang didn't tell me this. This is not what he is qualified to know now." Feng Qingwu's tone was light. "But in fact, there is nothing wrong with Tianlan's current state. He is only 24 years old. In 10 years, or even less, he will definitely break through again and become a real heavenly son. There is no sign that he can't break through, and he doesn't notice it himself. It's not that he can't break through." Feng Qingwu said calmly, "He can't break through. Once he takes that step on his own, he'll be discovered." "Discovered by who?" Qin Weibai's heart suddenly sank. Feng Qingwu moved her body and said softly, "Do you still remember that story? The other story you experienced, the end of His Majesty?" Qin Weibai's body quietly tensed up. That was undoubtedly her biggest secret. How did Feng Qingwu know? That's about it. But in that world, when everything happened, we all paid attention to it. But at that time, things were completely out of control, and we could no longer control the development of things. His Majesty took that step by himself in that world, and the end was already determined. Even if he didn't die under your sword, he would die in other places," Feng Qingwu said. Qin Weibai's face was a little gloomy. "You mean, if the current Tianlan breaks through again, he will die?" "Yes." Feng Qingwu's answer was without any hesitation. Qin Weibai sat on the bed in a daze. After a while, she asked, "How do you know what happened in that world?" "Time is meaningless." Feng Qingwu said something inexplicable and continued to say, "And the situation where you are now is a coincidence of time and space paradox. This is also the result of our efforts. In order to achieve this goal, we have paid a very heavy price." Feng Qingwu seemed to say something else. But Qin Weibai could not hear it at all. All her consciousness was attracted by Feng Qingwu's words. To achieve this goal. Forming this paradox. If the existence of two of her was really a kind of time and space paradox, then this was not a coincidence, but created by Feng Qingwu? Was she created by them? Qin Weibai suddenly felt like laughing and crying at the same time. "You mean, I'm something that you guys created? A machine? It has nothing to do with you." Feng Qingwu shook her head. "What we can do is to send you here. And to do all this, we did not create you, but to modify time and space and physical constants. You will understand all this, provided that your awakening is smooth enough." Qin Weibai sat there in a daze. After a long time, she whispered, "If I wake up successfully, what will happen to Tianlan?" "His Majesty will return." Feng Qingwu's voice was slow, but with unparalleled solemnity and fanaticism. Qin Weibai did not speak. Qin Weibai continued to say, "And what you need to do most is to synchronize your dream with His Majesty's thinking, as you imagine. This is the first step for His Majesty to return." "Wake up, return," Qin Weibai whispered softly. "If I wake up and he returns, will we still be us?" "Of course." Feng Qingwu seemed to be smiling. "In fact, you have woken up partly, but obviously, you do not feel any change in yourself, nor will you become another person." "I have woken up partly." Qin Weibai was stunned. Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai silently and whispered, "Maybe you don't realize it yourself, but you killed Chen Fangqing." After being stunned for a second, Qin Weibai suddenly reacted. "I didn't do it." "You don't need to do it." Feng Qingwu shook her head. "You have thought about it." Qin Weibai sat on the bed, hugged her shoulders tightly, and shook her head subconsciously. "Who the hell are you?" After a pause, she smiled somewhat self-deprecatingly. "Or, are you still human? Gods or demons?" "I am human." Feng Qingwu's tone was a little complicated, with certainty and a little confusion. She was silent for a moment and whispered, "Of course, in the eyes of others, they call me Dominator." "Of course, in the eyes of others, they call me Dominator." Qin Weibai did not speak. Her bright eyes were a mess, and countless thoughts appeared at the same time. She seemed to be a little confused and a little chaotic. "You don't look very well," Feng Qingwu said. "I'm just a little cold," Qin Weibai replied slowly. "If you need warmth," Feng Qingwu smiled, "I can give it to you." A soft and fluctuating light suddenly bloomed in front of Qin Weibai. Thousands of lights shone. The originally soft light became extremely cold in an instant. Feng Qingwu seemed to be reflecting the cold light of the metal. However, the surrounding air instantly became warm as spring. Time froze in an instant. The light of the metal was slightly refracted. The light shuttled and rushed into space at a speed faster than light. The virtual quantum network base station was instantly formed. Virtual shuttling and leaping in an instant. Feng Qingwu's consciousness went straight into the starry sky through the quantum network base station. The boundless Milky Way formed an incomparably dazzling yet extremely chaotic cosmic curve in her consciousness. The quantum transmission instantly crossed the distance of millions of light-years in the curve of the universe and went straight into the depths of the universe. Silence and dead silence appeared in an instant and disappeared in an instant. The perspective of her consciousness changed for half a second. Feng Qingwu's consciousness entered a large wormhole. The starry sky suddenly retreated. The wormhole shook violently. The boundless black tide seemed to tear the wormhole apart in the blink of an eye. It covered the sky and the earth and rushed directly to Feng Qingwu. It was a sword radiance that tore everything apart. It was crazy, cold, violent, domineering, with extreme excitement and calmness. With an almost invincible determination, the surging sword radiance completely covered Feng Qingwu. Feng Qingwu, whose consciousness was still reflecting the metal sword radiance, stopped for a moment. In the next second, an extremely majestic power instantly exploded in the sea of black sword chi. It was the extreme power of martial arts. The strong shock wave collided with the surging sword chi and the entire wormhole space was shaking violently. Feng Qingwu's movement paused slightly. All the power disappeared completely. In an instant, the boundless black tide seemed to have lost its target. It surged past her and rushed towards the entrance of the wormhole. "Boring," Feng Qingwu said calmly. "TSK," a voice seemed to be heard in the darkness. The voice came from an extremely far place accompanied by the intense collision sound. It was tough and calm. "You're indeed interesting, Lord. Is this what you're relying on to bully my son?" "I'm only teaching him what he should do," Feng Qingwu said calmly. In a faraway place, a voice that seemed to come from another space directly penetrated the wormhole. It was as hard as iron and carried with it an eerie sharpness. Perhaps I should also teach you a lesson and let you know what you should do. Oh. Feng Qingwu said calmly, you're fighting against those things now, how are you going to teach me? Based on the amount of sword chi that you can produce, which is not even a billionth of what you had at your peak. Humph. Countless sword chi shook violently. The wormhole shattered instantly. It was already a battlefield in front of Feng Qingwu. The voice from afar shattered the wormhole. Instead of bringing Feng Qingwu to her destination, it brought her to the battlefield. You're the Princess Royal of the space-time corridor. This is where you should be. The black ocean surged and roared in front of Feng Qingwu. The boundless black ocean surged up hundreds of thousands of feet into the sky. The sword radiance whistled and shattered the stars. Countless metallic objects fell into the black ocean. The area of the battlefield was almost calculated in terms of light years. The crazy killing did not stop for even a moment. Countless races, large amounts of metal, the sky was filled with mechas, and the dark, enshrouded shadows. Cannons, sword radiance, explosions, lacerations, and destruction. The endless number of battleships continued to pour out destructive power. The battlefield was filled with the humans and other races fighting against the dark shadows and mechas. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, it was vast and mighty, innumerable. Feng Qingwu sighed softly. Her body rose slowly in the void and charged towards her destination. The willpower of the god of war in the black ocean did not stop her this time. Feng Qingwu's speed increased. Boundless radiance shone from her body and became brighter and brighter. At this moment, she seemed to have turned into a shooting star that traversed the battlefield for a few light years. The radiance overflowed rapidly and surpassed the speed of light. With Feng Qingwu as the center, it spread rapidly in all directions. Deception, Genesis. Radiance shot out and stars fell. On the battlefield, the potentials of all the creatures in the neutral camp were instantly stimulated several times. All the heavily injured creatures that had lost their ability to fight were deceived. Everyone thought that they were in their peak condition. They exploded with battle power that exceeded their limits and pounced towards the nearby enemies. The battle power of all the creatures was increasing rapidly. Everyone had been deceived. At this moment, everyone thought that their strength had suddenly made a huge breakthrough. Everyone also showed their strength after the breakthrough. Outside of the neutral camp, all the creatures, be it order or dark shadow, became sluggish. They were also deceived. At this moment, they thought that they had been severely injured. Some of the creatures even thought that they had died. The shooting star radiance that Feng Qingwu brought along traversed the entire battlefield. It rose infinitely and exploded instantly. It was as if a gigantic sun had suddenly risen in the dead silent void. The boundless black ocean instantly began to boil. The rays of the sun continued to radiate with lies. In the shortest time possible, it deceived the entire battlefield. This was the pinnacle of the path of deception. It was also the pinnacle leader of the human race on this path. This was the pinnacle of power on the path of deception. This power had a name that was recognized by all the camps. Ruler. Chapter 1089. Shuttling, flying, warping, the battlefield covered every corner of one's vision. Countless figures filled every space with an unimaginable density. The vast void, the planets beneath one's feet, the broken satellites, the densely packed meteorite belts, the flames of war and radiance were everywhere. The densely packed formations of the fleets opened fire with all their might. The Star Destroyer cannons could destroy the heavens and the earth. The annihilation of dark matter and dark energy surged silently. A small black hole formed in a certain area of the battlefield and started to devour everything nearby. Using the void as a formation and the galaxy as a chess piece, Feng Qingwu's consciousness was tiny and weak like a speck of dust in the vast and boundless battlefield. However, it was this tiny and weak figure that traversed the entire battlefield in an instant as though she had entered an uninhabited land. The radiance that filled the sky continued to condense. Feng Qingwu's consciousness charged forward, leaving behind one sun after another that emitted extreme light and heat. The absolute destructive power and the instantaneous reversal of the situation clearly displayed the powerful strength of the peak energy source of the neutral camp. However, Feng Qingwu was not intercepted by the peak energy source of the opposing camp. Deception, Genesis. This was equivalent to simulating the real environment. In a short period of time, she made full use of all factors that were beneficial to her side and made full use of all factors that were disadvantageous to the enemy. She deceived both the enemy's and her allies' understanding of herself, as well as the perception of the peak energy source of the same level. In an absolutely short period of time, even if it was an enemy of the same level as Feng Qingwu, even if she traversed the battlefield in such a high-profile manner, no one would discover her existence. Based on the actual time in Miracle City and other places, the Genesis had existed for a very short period of time, probably less than 10 years. However, 10 years was enough to determine the fate of this part of the battlefield. However, what was the use of merely determining the fate of this part of the battlefield? The fate of the human race and all the neutral creatures had already been determined and would definitely end. Perhaps in the entire neutral camp, only the vast black ocean before them refused to give up. It was still going all out, still throwing caution to the wind, still going berserk without the slightest scruple. Perhaps he already knew his fate and ending long ago, but he did not care. War God Lin Xianyuan. He was a lunatic and a fool, but he was the most admirable kind of lunatic and fool. Feng Qingwu sighed softly. Endless light converged around her, and her shuttling figure suddenly accelerated. Like a sharp sword that tore through the battlefield, with slowly dissipating light, she instantly entered the black hole that had just formed in the battlefield. Deception, Supreme Self. On the battlefield where light and shadow intertwined, an almost supreme will appeared. It was cold, majestic, and irresistible. The moment this willpower appeared, it went against the evil intentions of the world. The black hole that was still taking shape instantly turned into a wormhole. The laws of time and space distorted at a speed visible to the naked eye. Feng Qingwu's body entered the wormhole and appeared tens of thousands of light years away in the blink of an eye. The moment her body entered the black hole, an endless army of the neutral faction rushed out of the same wormhole and joined the battlefield. This was the true ruler. On the battlefield, he ruled over everything. The black hole that had just formed was turned into a two-way passageway by Feng Qingwu's lies. It was the same entrance, but there was no difference between entering and exiting. This kind of deception could only last for a few years, but it was enough for the neutral camp to invest billions of soldiers into the battlefield in the next few years. The stars in the sky flickered and retreated rapidly. The newly formed wormhole extended infinitely in Feng Qingwu's consciousness. The darkness only lasted for a moment, but it was already tens of thousands of light years away. It was still the same scene, the same battlefield, the same black ocean, and the same war god Lin Xianyuan. The black ocean formed by the endless sword intense was the most real state of war god Lin Xianyuan, and also his most primitive form of existence. At the start of the war, this ocean surged into the corridor of time and space from the realm of war to the corridor of time and space. For tens of thousands of years, it spread across countless star regions. Everyone in the corridor of time and space agreed that this lunatic was the sharpest lunatic of the human race after His Majesty. The war continued. Even Feng Qingwu did not know how many star regions Lin Xuanyuan's sword aura had passed through and how many enemies of the same level as him had fought. Feng Qingwu did not look at the battlefield and continued to travel. Time and distance seemed to have lost their meaning. She traveled again and again. When Feng Qingwu's consciousness traveled through the wormhole, she suddenly felt a majestic force from the outside world penetrating the wormhole and instantly extending the distance she could travel. Feng Qingwu felt slightly relieved. She knew that she was finally close to her destination. This majestic force was the aura of the War King of the corridor of time and space. In the next second, the silence disappeared completely and there was no more killing. An extremely huge planet appeared in front of Feng Qingwu. This planet rotated slowly, almost occupying all of Feng Qingwu's consciousness. Feng Qingwu was in a trance for a moment. In front of this planet, Miracle City was like a child's toy block in front of a skyscraper. The strong contrast stunned Feng Qingwu, who had already placed all of her attention on Miracle City. She finally reached her destination. This was the capital of the corridor of time and space. Old Capital City. Feng Qingwu took a step forward. Her destination was very clear. Therefore, when she took a step, she deceived the distance between time and space. The chaotic meteorite belt and the atmosphere changed instantly. Feng Qingwu's consciousness had already appeared in an extremely huge palace. The ancient bronze palace was a little mottled and old. Faint lights flickered in every corner of the palace. The space was filled with a clear and ancient aura. In the palace, darkness and light bloomed at the same time and disappeared at the same time. Everything was silent. Qingwu, what's the matter? A gentle voice suddenly rang out inside the palace. An extremely gentle golden light suddenly lit up in the deepest part of the palace. Like the rising sun, the golden light shone from afar. The light and darkness in front of her instantly lost all their colors. That golden light instantly became the only thing in the palace. Feng Qingwu floated forward silently for a while. The further she went, the brighter and gentler the golden light became. The light shone on the bronze pillars in the palace, clearly illuminating the countless mottled marks on the bronze pillars. Feng Qingwu arrived at the end of the palace. A gentle golden light shone from the end of the palace. There was an ancient desk there. On the desk, there was a thick book that was about the height of a person. It was slowly flipping through the pages. There was no one behind the desk and the book. All the light was above the desk and the book. It was a light that was constantly changing. Sometimes, it was a divine weapon, sometimes, it was a misty cloud. In essence, this tiny and changing speck of light was a drop of blood. There was no corpse or shadow. It was just a drop of blood. Feng Qingwu looked at the drop of blood in front of her. She bowed slightly and said softly, "Greetings, Your Majesty." "What's the matter?" The gentle voice in the golden light was clear and gentle. "I want the million-world portrait." Feng Qingwu answered without any hesitation. Her voice was firm and unquestionable. The majesty in the golden light fell silent for a second. The million-world portrait. One of the most important weapons in the corridor of time and space. It was also one of the 4 most powerful divine weapons in the neutral camp. King Wei, million-world portrait, Tower of Human Emperor, Shenyuan sword. Among the 4 divine weapons, the million-world portrait was ranked second. It had never changed in countless reincarnations. If Feng Qingwu was the pinnacle representative of deceit, then the majesty in front of her was the pinnacle of calligraphers and warriors. The million-world portrait was something that the majesty had studied for his entire life. Not only did it contain his calligraphy, but it also contained the calligraphy of every calligrapher in the corridor of time and space. The million-world portrait had existed for thousands of years. Every painting had the ability to split open the sky. Similarly, the million-world portrait was the only divine weapon in the corridor of time and space that could contain the majesty's drop of blood. Without the million-world portrait, the vitality of the majesty's drop of blood would gradually dissipate. He would become weaker and weaker until he died. It was destined to be a long time. Unfortunately, time was meaningless. Since there was a possibility of death, the reality of death might appear in the next second. It might be 10,000 years for Feng Qingwu, or a minute for the majesty, sure. A second later, the majesty's voice was heard. "Which one do you want?" "The Book of Creation." Feng Qingwu seemed a little surprised, but she still answered the majesty's question quickly. The thick book on the table flipped a few pages and a clear tearing sound was heard in the palace. A thin page fell out of the book and landed in Feng Qingwu's hand. It was as light as a feather. However, the thick book on the table became thinner by about 10%. Streaks of vital energy flew out of the palace and spread into the void. It was the vitality of the majesty's blood dissipating. Feng Qingwu remained silent for a while and said softly, "Thank you." The Majesty's laughter echoed in the bronze palace. It was carefree and calm. Why? Feng Qingwu couldn't help but ask. The Majesty seemed a little confused. The Book of Creation is very important to you too. Feng Qingwu said, if I'm not wrong, you spent most of your time resting in the Book of Creation. The vitality of your blood overflowed into the Book of Creation and returned to your body. How long could you last without the Book of Creation? Actually, I was mentally prepared for you to reject me because of the corridor of time and the human race. The human race's overall situation, His Majesty whispered to himself and then laughed. His laughter was very soft at first, but then it became louder and louder. However, it was not the kind of hysterical laughter. This laughter was clear, calm, indifferent, open-minded, and finally turned into a faint tiredness. The human clan. What's the big picture? Feng Qingwu was shocked and asked subconsciously, what do you mean? Exactly what I said. The Majesty said calmly, I gave you the Book of Creation because you need it more than I do. Tell me about Her Highness's situation. Her situation is very special. Feng Qingwu was a little uneasy and thought about the Majesty's words. She said subconsciously, in the past few samsara cycles, even if there were returnees, none of them were at the level of the two of them. Their existence can't be replicated. The so-called experience we summarized is only based on the other returnees and the process of your return. In fact, no matter you, me, or anyone else, is worthy of being mentioned in the same breath as them. We can't speculate the process of their return. According to my observation, Your Majesty Tianlan has now vaguely come into contact with part of the power of Tianju. This also means that if Your Majesty returns, you will at least reach the 7th level of authority. This is only the most conservative estimate. Tianju, the Majesty pondered and sighed softly. This time, does it start from martial arts? Martial arts has never been for the weak. Feng Qingwu said indifferently, over the years, the King of War has lost some competitiveness. You haven't taken any action. Countless people in the corridor of time and space think that the path of martial arts has lost its former glory. But is that really the case? Of course not. The Majesty laughed softly. This is the first path of the human race. Perhaps compared to order and shadow, it has congenital flaws and shortcomings. But I always believe that this path represents true invincibility. Look at Lin Xianyuan and Wang Fuxing. Feng Qingwu said. When His Majesty didn't take action, the two from the God of War realm and the Emperor Palace represented the peak of martial arts in the neutral camp, the God of War. Lin Xianyuan stood at the pinnacle of martial arts and had personally slain the apocalypse of the Order faction. The current God of War was the strongest blade cutting through thorns and thorns for the human race. The most ancient path of martial arts was constantly bursting forth with great vitality in the most chaotic and dangerous situation. Therefore, Feng Qingwu didn't think there was any problem with his path of return. What about Her Highness? His Majesty asked slowly. Feng Qingwu obviously hesitated and said softly, I'm not very sure. But so far, she seems to have shown some ability that belongs to Dream, but it is very weak. It is precisely because of this ability that she came into contact with the real imprint that Your Majesty left in the deepest part of her consciousness in order to protect her. I think this should be caused by Her Highness who is now in hibernation. But we can't detect her situation. We can only detect something from Qin Weibai. This is also what I want to say. Her Highness could survive because of the real imprint that Your Majesty left in the deepest part of her consciousness. That is to say, Your Majesty's real imprint is in Qin Weibai's consciousness. Now Your Majesty has shown an ability similar to the heavenly end. If Her Highness Qin Weibai can further wake up and synchronize her consciousness with Your Majesty's, then His Majesty may come into contact with his real imprint and speed up the pace of return. In that case, when His Majesty returns, he may not be a heavenly end, but... Feng Qingwu paused and said, God of Massacre. His Majesty let out a sigh of relief. With expectation and understanding, he said, so you want the picture of all worlds? Yes. Feng Qingwu said slowly, but I didn't expect you to really give it to me. The topic came back again. His Majesty didn't avoid it this time. He just said softly, it doesn't matter. There is nothing in the space-time corridor that can't be given to them. The big picture. Without the space-time corridor, the so-called big picture is just an illusion. Suddenly, the faint golden light began to brighten. His Majesty's voice became calm and determined. Maybe I should go out for a walk, in case the god of war takes all the limelight. Some of the premonitions in his heart became reality. Feng Qingwu's heart slightly sank. You're right. His Majesty said calmly. The golden light began to leave the desk and move forward slowly. Maybe this is the last time we meet. His Majesty's voice was calm and powerful. There will be no miracle. We are about to face another failure. Our doomsday is coming. I'm ashamed to face His Majesty and Her Highness. His Majesty said softly, as the human emperor of the space-time corridor, I have never really completed my mission in the long years. All of us are ashamed to face His Majesty and Her Highness. The human clan has never obtained the right to survive. His Majesty laughed self-deprecatingly. It has never happened. Neutral camp. The god of war dominated the world. The human emperor was calm. The 4 great divine artifacts stabilized the overall situation. In the long years, countless reincarnations, they were destroyed and reborn in the illusion and reality. The human clan was like an ant. They had always been fighting for survival, but they had never obtained the right to survive. What they obtained was just the power to struggle. They tried their best, tried everything, and struggled desperately without compromising. Then they were destroyed and exterminated again and again. Everything must have an end. When I return again, I am still me, but also not me. His Majesty looked at Feng Qingwu and said softly, you are still you, but also not you. When I return again, maybe I won't be your sister. Whatever it is. His Majesty laughed softly. You should also arrange a way out for yourself. My way out is in the City of Miracles. Feng Qingwu said softly. She had already found a suitable candidate, so she was not afraid of the end of the world. Her smile was even a little happy. I can be his daughter again. The only regret is that I have to change my mother. That should be a good candidate. His Majesty laughed. He looked into the distance, and his gaze seemed to fall on the person who was also called the human emperor in the human palace, on the god of war who was still slowly struggling in the void, on King Jinjian, on the king of war, and on all the human clan. Everything must have an end. The other party was already here. So he would fall. Feng Qingwu would fall. The god of war would also fall. Everyone's ending had long been destined, and it would come to an end. Let's go. His Majesty said softly. In the bronze palace, the golden light instantly bloomed and shot straight into the distant void. Feng Qingwu gently raised her palm. In the extremely distant void, a big hand filled with dark energy and dark matter instantly formed. The world was deceived by lies. The illusory hand slowly moved down and finally enveloped a star that was at its peak. In the next second, the big hand disappeared. The star also disappeared. The endless light and heat were instantly replaced by the cold void. A pearl that was burning with warm light appeared in Feng Qingwu's hand. She picked up the stars with her bare hands. Feng Qingwu calmly held the pearl and slowly put it into the page of the chapter of creation in her other hand. The yellowed page instantly became warm and shone with a soft light. The soft light gently fluctuated, and Feng Qingwu's figure disappeared. Only the bronze palace was left. It was silent, dead, and empty, as if it had existed since ancient times, without any vitality. Feng Qingwu opened her eyes again. In her sight was the wind and snow outside the hotel. It was Qin Weibai, who was quietly hugging her snow-white shoulders on the bed. Chapter 1090. Time was meaningless. Feng Qingwu's consciousness traveled through the void. Her time was moving, but Qin Weibai's time was still. Therefore, everything happened in less than a second. In Qin Weibai's consciousness, Feng Qingwu said that she could give her warmth. She didn't do anything extra, but a light and delicate page appeared on her slender palm. The moment the hazy light appeared, it seemed to completely suppress the light in the bedroom. The hotel room seemed to have ushered in dusk, becoming hazy, beautiful, and warm. That touch of warmth slowly spread out, allowing one to subconsciously relax both mentally and physically. Qin Weibai raised her head and looked at the page in Feng Qingwu's hand. Feng Qingwu loosened the page in Qin Weibai's direction and said gently, "A gift for you." "What is this?" Qin Weibai asked after being stunned for a while. The item in Feng Qingwu's hand looked like a thin piece of paper, yet it also looked like a light source that would never dry up. The piece of paper was dark yellow and old, and the light was sparse and hazy. It did not look beautiful, but it attracted everyone's attention and consciousness almost instinctively, as if all the light had appeared on that piece of paper. "This is what you need the most." Feng Qingwu loosened her palm slightly. The paper fluttered into Qin Weibai's hand without a trace of smoke or fire. Sadness flashed across her eyes, which were enveloped by the gentle light. Then, they became a little hollow. The creation chapter of the Picture of Thousand Worlds. This was the foundation of the Picture of Thousand Worlds, one of the 4 divine weapons of the neutral camp. It was also the first chapter. Now that the creation chapter had been removed, the Picture of Thousand Worlds had lost its foundation. The drop of blood that relied on the Picture of Thousand Worlds had also lost its foundation. Without Her Majesty, the neutral camp had lost its foundation. The real end was coming. There was no way to stop it or resist it. Perhaps it was just like what Her Majesty had said, the human race no longer had the so-called big picture. Because everything would be destroyed. In the face of extreme extinction, all perseverance was meaningless. Feng Qingwu knew that was really the last time she met Her Majesty. After extinction, we return again. He is not him, and I am not me. Since the beginning of the human clan's emergence in the starry sky, they had been struggling with all their might to survive. The first His Majesty and Her Highness had tried their best, paid everything, and failed again and again. In the end, they became the currently Tianlan and Qin Weibai. Now that His Majesty had taken over the authority, he had also tried hard, but failed again and again. There was no direction, no end, no hope. Standing at the highest point of the camp and looking forward, there was only ghastly darkness. The stranger road brought with it eternal silence and dullness that stretched to the end of despair. Just like everyone wants to live, but everyone will die. No one had ever achieved true immortality, and no one had ever fought for the right of survival for the human race. The history of the development of the human race seemed to be one of continuous failures from beginning to end, with no success at all. This period of history was recorded in the Million World Scroll, and it became one of the most powerful artifacts in the neutral faction. Meanwhile, the drop of blood that His Majesty had transformed into had already left the ancient book and rushed back into the void. The end was just around the corner. He would not go back. Vast and boundless battlefields now covered every star field, and the flames of war continued to burn. The chaotic light would reach Earth many years later, but even if Earth still existed at that time, the war would have already ended. Feng Qingwu was in a trance. She could imagine the scene of that drop of blood rushing into the void after leaving the Million World Scroll. She could also imagine the insolence of him facing countless peak existences with his Shenyuan sword. That was the scene that had once appeared in the chaotic river of time. It was peerless and invincible, the last sad song of the human clan. Everything would end. That drop of blood was now burning everything. He was destroying the corridor of time and space that he had created, and was using all means to restart the reincarnation for the human clan. Feng Qingwu sighed softly, looked at Qin Weibai, and said softly, "There's not much time left." "What?" Qin Weibai was stunned. Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai silently. She walked to the bed and sat down. Hesitantly, she reached out and hugged Qin Weibai. An incomparably soft brilliance completely enveloped Qin Weibai. In the light, Qin Weibai saw a beautiful face that was somewhat similar to her and Li Tianlan's. The moment their bodies touched, Qin Weibai's heart suddenly skipped a beat. It was an incomparably real and clear feeling of being connected by blood. That feeling was so obvious, yet so unfamiliar. Your mental state isn't very good right now. The thing I gave you can help you stabilize your consciousness and make you calmer. Feng Qinggu said softly. Qin Weibai was still recalling the feeling of that hug. It felt like she was hugging a child that she had not seen for many years. It was a little strange, but the feeling of being connected by blood was so real and close. Qin Weibai did not have children, so she could not accurately describe that feeling. But the moment Feng Qinggu hugged her, her whole heart seemed to be completely melted. After a while, Feng Qinggu let go of Qin Weibai. You said that my mental state is not stable? She asked softly. Feng Qinggu nodded and said yes. If, Qin Weibai silently thought about her own state. She was a master in the field of spirit. Before today, no, even until now, she did not feel that her mental state was unstable. What was happening now was really a bit magical. But Qin Weibai, who had even experienced the so-called rebirth, did not feel that she could not bear those inexplicable but not too clear things. If my unstable state continues, what will happen? I don't know. Feng Qinggu shook her head. I never predict things that will not happen. You have received my gift, so your problem is no longer a problem. If I have to speculate, maybe you will become a lunatic, or a psychopath, or something else. But these are not important now. What's important is that my gift can help you a lot. Is that so? Qin Weibai whispered to herself and looked down at the page floating in her hand. The star that Feng Qinggu had placed in the book had already been compressed into the purest and most gentle energy. The energy that was countless times more powerful than the sun was compressed infinitely and filled every corner of the chapter of creation gently. It brought warmth and relaxation to the reader's body and mind. But even if this page was injected with the energy of a large star, it was still dark on the page. Only the extremely hazy and warm light penetrated through the darkness. Qin Weibai looked at it silently. There seemed to be a mass of black fog in the glowing dark paper, but it was also like a dense chaos. The absolute silence and darkness seemed to be completely still. This kind of color attracted all of Qin Weibai's attention. She kept looking at it, and then suddenly realized that the black on the paper was not necessarily pure darkness. Even darkness could not be so quiet. This darkness was like real nothingness. There was nothing, not even darkness. The absolute nothingness seemed to condense into a point of infinite mass, infinitely small volume, and infinitely high density. This point of nothingness slowly rotated on the page. In silence, without a sound, without a change in expression. Qin Weibai was silent for a long time before she whispered, I don't feel anything wrong with my spirit. By the time you can feel it, it will be too late. Feng Qinggu shook her head. Maybe you won't believe what I said, but some signs have already appeared. You and the other you existed at the same time, but you were originally a part of the space-time paradox. However, the other you started to walk on the path of awakening in the process of near extinction. During this period of time, your consciousness has been cut off. However, this is not cutting off, but the gap between the two of you has widened. This has already increased the mental burden on you, and you didn't even feel the changes in yourself. The most obvious point is that you did not want to kill Chen Fengqing so soon, but in fact, you have already killed him. This means that your spirit has been out of control to some extent. I did not kill Chen Fengqing. Holding this page, Qin Weibai was unprecedentedly sober. She seemed to really calm down, and her voice became stable. But you wanted to kill him. Feng Qinggu said. Qin Weibai frowned and vaguely felt that she had caught something. But when she asked Feng Qinggu, she could not hear Feng Qinggu's answer at all. Qin Weibai thought for a moment and suddenly thought of a very important question. A very slight chill flashed in her eyes, and she whispered, "I remembered one thing." "What?" Feng Qingwu was a little confused. "You said that I am an extremely rare paradox of time and space. Obviously, no matter how rare I am now, I am not the only one. If I am a paradox, then how do you explain Jiang Shangyu? Is he also a paradox created by you?" Qin Weibai asked. Jiang Shangyu, there was a strange emotion in Feng Qingwu's voice. It seemed to be uneasiness, solemnity, and hesitation. He can be said to be a paradox of time and space, but also not. What I can say is that Jiang Shangyu's existence has nothing to do with us, but his existence is also reasonable. Reasonable, Qin Weibai showed a very small but obvious sneer. This is the only explanation. In Jiang Shangyu's current state, it is not surprising that anything happens to him. No matter what. Oh. Qin Weibai raised her eyebrows slightly. Yes, anything. Feng Qingwu emphasized her tone. For example, you may find that Jiang Shangyu can break through several realms overnight, and you may even find that Jiang Shangyu suddenly becomes stronger than His Majesty Li Tianlan, that Jiang Shangyu suddenly becomes extremely sharp and intelligent, and even becomes an unprecedented wise man. In a way, these are all possible, but such possibilities are two-sided. You may also find that Jiang Shangyu loses all his strength overnight, and that Jiang Shangyu's decision suddenly becomes as stupid as a stupid pig. You may even find that Jiang Shangyu suddenly becomes a woman. These are also possible. Qin Weibai was speechless for a long time. Her expression became a little strange. Jiang Shangyu suddenly became a woman. She knew that this was unlikely, but she couldn't help thinking about this possibility. It was incredible. This was absolutely unimaginable. This kind of change of different degrees may last for a long time, or the interval may be very short. What I want to say is that Jiang Shangyu's changes are not a disguise, but he is really changing, because he himself is already chaotic now. The bedroom suddenly became dark for a moment. The light and even the energy of the stars in the pages were all extinguished. Qin Weibai heard an extremely clear sound of breaking. Absolute darkness appeared and disappeared abruptly. Feng Qingwu appeared in front of Qin Weibai again. Her body was still shrouded in light, but at this time, the soft light suddenly became extremely messy. Every light seemed to be torn and cut by someone, and they were arranged in a very chaotic state. Feng Qingwu's breath was much weaker than before, but her body was still straight. "Take my gift for you." Feng Qingwu whispered, "It will only be good for you, and it will not cause you any harm." Qin Weibai silently grasped the pages in her hand. She was silent for a long time, and then whispered, "I have some questions." "Go ahead." Feng Qingwu always remained respectful and calm. "What is?" Qin Weibai just opened her mouth. At this moment, she suddenly remembered something she heard when she saw Xianyuan Wushang, and also heard some of Xianyuan Wushang's murmurs. However, as soon as these thoughts appeared, they disappeared abruptly. The light in front of her suddenly shook. In the light, Feng Qingwu's face seemed to change dramatically. No one knew what she had done. Qin Weibai instantly forgot the question she wanted to ask, and her mind went blank. "I can't answer that question." Feng Qingwu whispered, "Similarly, you can't ask." Question. Qin Weibai was a little shocked. What was so serious? What did she want to ask her just now? She frowned tightly and was silent for a long time. Qin Weibai, who couldn't remember what she wanted to ask just now, suddenly changed the topic. "Do you know calligraphers?" Feng Qingwu paused and nodded slightly. "Yes." Qin Weibai was extremely awkward. She knew that she had just forgotten a very important question, and the question about calligraphers could have echoed with the question she had forgotten, so that she could notice something. But now she didn't know what she had forgotten, so the question was extremely abrupt. "Are you also a calligrapher?" Qin Weibai glanced at Feng Qingwu. "I'm not." Feng Qingwu shook her head. "I'm a dominator." "It's not a code name, just a title." "Dominator, Qin Weibai thought silently and suddenly felt that this title was much better than calligrapher's. Compared with this title, the latter was simply too weak. You said that I will wake up and return. What will I be after I return? A dominator? Or a calligrapher? Or a doctor? Feng Qingwu was silent for a long time before she whispered, neither. If you wake up successfully, you will become. She hesitated for a full half a minute before she whispered, a devil. Qin Weibai was stunned for a long time before she said with a look of disgust, it sounds so bad. I don't like it. Feng Qingwu smiled helplessly. In fact, she knew very well that neither Li Tianlan nor Qin Weibai had a chance to really return completely. Because the end was close at hand. The only thing they could do now was to activate the real brand and wait for the next return. Feng Qingwu couldn't feel the end that was close at hand. Currently, there were only 3 people in the entire human race who could sense this. His Majesty of the Space-Time Corridor. The Human Emperor of the Human Palace. The God of War of the War God Realm. So she didn't know how long it would be before the real end, but she knew that it was very close. Qin Weibai unconsciously rubbed the warm page in her hand, trying to fold the page little by little. The page kept getting smaller and smaller as it was folded. Getting smaller and smaller. Feng Qingwu watched quietly. Qin Weibai's expression changed little by little. Because the page was getting smaller with every fold. It wasn't getting smaller after folding, but the page was constantly disappearing as she folded it. With the last fold, the page completely disappeared in Qin Weibai's hand. This phenomenon, Qin Weibai had already understood without Feng Qingwu's explanation. She laughed a little self-deprecatingly, a little bitterly and a little pitifully. My gift has already gone to the other me, right? Feng Qingwu looked at her without saying a word. She wanted to answer but couldn't. So, Qin Weibai whispered, this is not a gift, or rather, it's not my gift. Feng Qingwu still didn't speak. I see. Qin Weibai whispered, in your eyes, I'm just a tool that can help Tianlan wake up, a tool that can help the other me wake up, right? It's not like that. Feng Qingwu whispered. She couldn't say the specific content, so this sentence was more like an extremely weak comfort. Qin Weibai smiled. She silently put on her clothes and looked at her empty palm. But so what, even so, her eyes were in a trance for a moment, and she whispered, I still love him very much. Feng Qingwu sighed softly. You're very sad. Not really. Qin Weibai shook her head. She opened her palm, looked at it, and whispered, it's just a little sad. I feel like a chess piece at your mercy. Not only me, but also Tianlan and the other me, are they all chess pieces in your hands? No one is qualified to treat you and His Majesty as chess pieces. Feng Qingwu's tone was very firm. But Qin Weibai didn't speak. Her body stiffened without any warning, and then began to tremble slightly. Qin Weibai opened her eyes wide and stared at her empty palm. Her eyes were completely filled with an extremely strong fear in a very short time. Qin Weibai opened her palm. At this moment it was also the moment when Xing Tian next door heard the extremely loud sound. The next second, Qin Weibai's somewhat trembling scream rang out because of fear. There's something in my hand. They're moving. There's something in my hand. With a strong scream, Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai with a complicated look and whispered, this is the biggest sin, this is blasphemy. You're blaspheming yourself. Chapter 1091. Qin Weibai didn't hear Feng Qingwu's voice. To be exact, she couldn't hear anything now. Intense fear swept through her like a hurricane, and strong negative emotions completely drowned all her thoughts like a tsunami. At this moment, Qin Weibai's spiritual world was already falling apart. She couldn't care less about Feng Qingwu and just stared at her palm. The palm was slender, white, and slender. It could be called an absolutely perfect pair of hands. But Qin Weibai could feel that there was something in her hand. It was not a microorganism like bacteria. Or rather, a different kind of microorganism. She could clearly feel that the invisible thing in her hand was coming alive little by little. Vaguely, she could even feel that the vitality of the thing in her hand was becoming stronger and stronger. They seemed to be tightly together, exploring, communicating, and whispering on her palm. That kind of subtle thought activity was transmitted to Qin Weibai's consciousness very clearly, making her tremble all over. She suddenly raised her head, looked at Feng Qinggu, and said blankly, "I really have something in my hand." "I believe you." Feng Qinggu nodded. The light shrouded her whole body, and her eyes lit up with a faint light. It was like the ray of an electronic instrument. Feng Qinggu's pupils contracted slightly, and her eyes fell on Qin Weibai's palm. The change in her pupils was very small. But such a small change made Feng Qinggu's sight magnify more than most of the microscopes on the earth. In such a sight, she could even clearly see the countless atoms and molecules that made up Qin Weibai's palm. She also saw the thing in Qin Weibai's palm. The thing that she called the greatest sin and blasphemy. Feng Qinggu stretched out her palm and gently rubbed Qin Weibai's fingertips. Her movement was slow and gentle like the wind. Qin Weibai was slightly stunned. "Do you still have something now?" Feng Qinggu asked with a smile. That weak but extremely clear breath disappeared. Qin Weibai felt that her palms had become clean again. She shook her head subconsciously, and didn't know what to say for a moment. "You should have a good rest." Feng Qinggu said softly, "Your mental state is becoming more and more unstable, just like the thing in your hand. I can say that if those little things are not discovered, the troubles that they will bring to us in the future will be beyond our imagination. Just like we said, this is the greatest sin, and the greatest blasphemy." "Blasphemy," Qin Weibai murmured to herself. She didn't seem to take it seriously. A strong sense of sleepiness rose and circled in her mind. Qin Weibai sat on the bed, and her essence, qi, and spirit gradually began to decline. "You should rest." Feng Qinggu said softly as she sat by the bed and hummed an ancient yet extremely gentle ballad. Her memory returned to her childhood. When she was very young, her mother would often hold her in her arms and gently hum this song. After so many meaningless years, Feng Qinggu never expected that she would sit by the bed and hum this song to coax her mother to sleep. "Mother," Feng Qinggu looked at Qin Weibai, who was gradually falling asleep, with a complicated look in her eyes. In a sense, she was indeed his mother, but she was no longer his mother. Qin Weibai gradually fell asleep. Feng Qinggu stood up and looked down at her palm. The will of life and aura that Qin Weibai sensed were constantly recovering in her hands. If they could be regarded as living creatures, then if she released them now, their strength would even be no worse than Li Tianlan's. Feng Qingwu's expression became even more complicated and extremely cold. She looked at the creature in her hand and remained silent for a long time. This was Qin Weibai's ability. To put it bluntly, this was the power of a demon. But this was not the power of the neutral camp. The beginning of the Devil's Path was known as the Medical Examiner and belonged to the Order faction. Qin Weibai's existence was extremely special, and it was precisely because of this uniqueness that she became the first person in the history of the human race to reach the peak of the power path of the Order camp. So far, she was also the only person who stood at the peak of the Order camp and hadn't been assimilated by the Order camp. Even Li Tianlan had never achieved such uniqueness. Therefore, Qin Weibai became the first and only demon in the history of the human clan. What does a demon mean? If being omnipotent and omniscient was the clearest and most straightforward explanation for the Order camp, then to a certain extent, a demon was synonymous with omnipotence. Feng Qinggu looked at her palm. Qin Weibai wasn't crazy. What she said was true. There was indeed something in her hand. To be exact, there were two creatures. In Feng Qingwu's vision, which was magnified hundreds of thousands of times, the appearance of the two creatures was clear and real in her sight. They were two humanoid creatures. A man and a woman. They were creatures that were exactly the same as Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. It was as if their bodies had suddenly shrunk countless times and become microorganisms. They were extremely small, but Feng Qingwu could clearly feel a strong sense of indifference and absolute order from them. Two similar or identical creatures were born in the hands of the demons of the Order camp countless years ago. And that time, it directly caused the anger of countless races in the entire neutral camp. His Majesty in the corridor of time and space controlled the Xianyuan sword with his own power, turning the nearly endless fortune of the human race into a sharp light that filled the sky. Wherever the tip of the Xianyuan sword pointed, the demon and all of its kind perished, dyeing the starry river red. That was a war that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It was also after that war that the demon's crime was defined as the greatest blasphemy in the history of the space-time corridor. That was a rare concession from the Order camp. Since then, similar creatures had never appeared again. But now, such creatures like Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai were created by Qin Weibai herself. She had unintentionally blasphemed herself. There was an extremely violent heartbeat in her ears, and it didn't stop. Every heartbeat was like thunder echoing in the sky. The loud sound exploded in everyone's ears, almost shattering everyone's consciousness. It was the heartbeat of the two creatures in Feng Qingwu's hands. Feng Qingwu closed her palms expressionlessly. In the void, the loud heartbeat that ordinary people couldn't detect suddenly quickened for a moment, and then completely stopped. Feng Qingwu walked out of the room and went directly to the room opposite the suite that belonged to Xing Tian and Xianyuan Wushang. Xing Tian's huge body was curled up, twitching and rolling in extreme pain. Feng Qingwu closed her palms, and the moment the heartbeat stopped, Xing Tian's body stiffened for a moment. All the pain seemed to disappear, and he slowly calmed down. Feng Qingwu waved her hands slightly. At this moment, she was no longer in charge. The whole world treated her as a doctor in her lies. A pure light bathed Xing Tian's body. Xing Tian's pale face instantly became ruddy, and his breath began to calm down. All the injuries and pain disappeared completely. Xing Tian slowly opened his eyes and saw the light floating in front of him. He couldn't see the scene in the light clearly, but he could feel a wisp of aura in the light. Xing Tian's expression changed slightly. He subconsciously knelt on one knee and said in a deep voice, "Greetings, Princess Royal." Up. Feng Qingwu shook her head and glanced at him. "You're in good shape." Yes, Xing Tian seemed to be still in shock. He recalled the extremely strong heartbeat that almost broke all his willpower, and said with a trembling voice, "Just now, that's not something you should know." Feng Qingwu said lightly, "Keep it a secret." "Yes." Xing Tian nodded subconsciously. "Your calligraphy was disturbed. Chen Fengqing's death is directly related to Her Highness Qin Weibai. You wrote the cause of Chen Shi's death, but it was led to the cause of Chen Fengqing's death, which is related to Her Highness. You didn't die on the spot, which means that the interference was completely unconscious. That is to say, the other party didn't know about your existence." Feng Qingwu said lightly, "You continue to investigate the cause of Chen Shi's death, and pay attention to avoid some places that need to be avoided." Xing Tian nodded silently. He agreed with what Feng Qingwu said. Calligraphers mainly used the power of karma. Even if Qin Weibai and Li Tianlan hadn't woken up, Xing Tian couldn't write their karma by force. If their real imprints in silence revealed a little bit of aura, Xing Tian might die on the spot. If the real murderer who killed Chen Shi really knew about his and Xianyuan Wushang's existence and deliberately guided them, Xing Tian would have been a corpse by now. "Princess, if you do it yourself," Xing Tian was silent, and suddenly said with some hesitation, "I know who it is. Jiang Shangyu, just a polluted wretch." Feng Qingwu shook her head gently, "But there is a shadow mark on her, which is of a very high level. That mark is now attached to Jiang Shangyu's soul, and it seems to be in a state of chaos. If I do it myself, that mark will wake up, and the location of Miracle City may be directly exposed." Feng Qingwu said softly, "I'll leave this matter to you. For the time being, you don't have to rush to kill Jiang Shanyu. Help His Majesty stabilize the current passive situation first. Xing Tian nodded. In their eyes, everything in Miracle City was extremely backward, even a place that seemed to be destroyed at will. This place didn't seem important, but it was very important. After all, this was the real environment. Every step of Li Tianlan's development here was directly related to the degree of awakening of his real mark and the upper limit of his future. Xianyuan Wushang and Xing Tian were guides, but they were responsible for more than just guiding. When necessary, they were responsible for paving some roads for Li Tianlan. This was their duty. Feng Qingwu took a deep look at him and said lightly, "I'm leaving." Countless lights bloomed in front of Xing Tian. Xing Tian suddenly thought of something and said, "Princess." The light kept refracting in the bedroom and rushed into the messy snow outside the hotel. The night sky was quiet, and the world was silvery white. When all the light dissipated, Feng Qingwu's figure had completely disappeared from the bedroom. Chapter 1092. When her consciousness turned from sober to trance again, Qin Weibai found herself in a dream again. The garden that her consciousness had constructed in her dream had disappeared. Qin Weibai found that she seemed to be in a half-lying position in the air. She looked around blankly. The giant black tree full of metal fragments stood there quietly. It seemed to have been dead for a long time. Perhaps it was in the dream, so Qin Weibai could still feel that the dead tree still had a weak vitality. A drop of black juice flowed down from the trunk at a very slow speed, but the evil aura contained in it had long disappeared. Qin Weibai looked around silently and suddenly found that she did not see the shadow beside the giant black tree. She was slightly shocked and subconsciously wanted to sit up from a half-lying position. When she waved her arms, her palms seemed to touch something cold and soft. Qin Weibai was stunned and looked around her. Only then did she find that the shadow she was looking for was close at hand. However, the shadow of Li Tianlan was even dimmer, almost completely transparent, and disappeared. Now she seemed to be lying in the arms of the shadow, but if she did not look carefully, Qin Weibai could not find his existence at all. Qin Weibai stood up. In the dream, she observed the darkness around her with the clearest consciousness. The flying snow, the sun, the garden, everything disappeared. It wasn't until the moment she stood up that she realized that it wasn't just the things she had constructed. Even the giant black tree beside her seemed to be slowly disappearing. The giant tree began to become transparent, and the shadow beside her was also becoming dimmer and dimmer. There was a kind of emptiness around that made people feel extremely depressed. It seemed to be black all around. But it also seemed that there was no color. Not only color, but there was nothing here. Sound, light, perception, and even space and time, everything was quickly fading away. Qin Weibai wanted to move forward, but suddenly found that she could not move at all. Or rather, it was not that she could not move. Because there was no space here. There was no front or back, up or down, left or right. In the void of nothing, the movement of moving forward did not exist at all. Gradually, Qin Weibai even lost the idea of moving forward. The giant black tree disappeared quickly. Li Tianlan's shadow also disappeared completely. Qin Weibai felt that she seemed to be disappearing little by little in the dream. Everything in the world seemed to be coming to an end. This kind of ending was not death, but true, purest nothingness. Qin Weibai gradually became a little confused and lost. Her consciousness seemed to be completely trapped in this empty void, quietly feeling the changes in this void. Time seemed to pass in an instant. Qin Weibai was trapped here in silence. She did not know what was going on, nor did she bother to think about it. She did not even know who she was. She seemed to have become a part of the void, an eternal existence in the illusory dreamland. Until a glimmer of light appeared in front of her. This glimmer was so faint that it was difficult for the naked eye to capture it. Not to mention the naked eye, even the most advanced microscope would find it difficult to see this glimmer of light. However, he was surrounded by the most extreme nothingness. Therefore, no matter how dim this ray of light was, it was still a pure ray of light. It was extremely eye-catching in this void. Qin Weibai watched all this quietly. The ray of light in the void began to become brighter and brighter. But there was no space around it. All the light was compressed into a point. More and more light began to produce various reactions in the extreme compression. The mass of the light was getting larger and heavier, but the volume never changed. The surrounding nothingness remained unchanged. It was another long time. It was like a second, but also like a whole era. The light that had been constantly compressed seemed to be completely compressed to the extreme. Without a sound, the ray of light exploded in the empty void. It was the most terrifying and surging explosion. It was silent, but in an instant, it burned with a strong light that no one could look directly at. The strong light began to spread. So the void was disappearing. Space appeared. The strong light spread in the space where it appeared, and the distance was getting longer and longer. But the order of each ray of light was completely different. So time also appeared. The time and space that appeared in the beginning were extremely unstable, sometimes fast and sometimes slow, sometimes big and sometimes small. There was no rule, and it had been in the most chaotic state. But the explosion continued, and it was still spreading. The inner space continued to collapse in the center of the explosion, but the explosion continued to expand the surrounding space at the most extreme speed. Qin Weibai could clearly feel the blazing heat that could evaporate everything spreading with the space formed by the explosion. The temperature was extremely hot, and the speed of expansion with the explosion was also extremely fast. Some subtle and single basic substances were also becoming more and more numerous with the explosion. Only these basic substances could exist in such a high temperature. Basic particles such as electrons, photons, neutrinos, and elementary particles extended infinitely to all parts of the space. The explosion was still going on, or it would continue. The initial scorching temperature began to gradually decrease, and the surrounding density began to drop rapidly. The changes in the environment affected the basic existence form of matter. So atoms, atomic nuclei, and molecules began to appear gradually, and began to recombine into gas in the area after the explosion. The explosion had spread to an infinite distance, but it was still constantly eroding the surrounding nothingness. The space was getting bigger and bigger, and time and space began to stabilize. The initial gas slowly condensed into a nebula. The nebula was changing, evolving, and slowly forming all kinds of stars and galaxies. The original panorama of the world appeared little by little in Qin Weibai's vague consciousness, grand and magnificent. Time seemed to be accelerated countless times, and also seemed to be slowed down countless times. The space was constantly expanding, and her vision was getting farther and farther, so the so-called time completely lost its meaning of existence. She watched the nothingness become space, and the space produced by the explosion was expanding endlessly. She saw the sky full of nebula turn into starlight, and the world was being born little by little. The galaxy rotated around her, and began to reveal the truth of the world little by little. She seemed to be standing at the center of the whole world, watching the whole process of the world from nothing to something. It was like a chapter of the creation of the world. Qin Weibai's consciousness began to recover little by little. She flew far away to an unknown place, and her vision began to return. Hundreds of millions of galaxies revolved around her, forming an incomparably complex pattern. A warm glimmer rose from her side. The light continued to combine, and finally became an extremely thick page. This was a gift from Feng Qinggu. Qin Weibai thought for a long time before she understood what it was. It did not return to the master of Samsara Palace, but appeared in her dream, or appeared in the depths of her consciousness. A vague feeling began to reverberate in her consciousness. At this moment, Qin Weibai's consciousness completely woke up from the trance. She silently looked at the slowly moving starry sky in front of her and remained silent for a long time. In this starry sky, she once again felt the existence of Li Tianlan's virtual shadow and the giant black tree beside Li Tianlan. She could even feel the giant black tree constructed by her own consciousness. That garden. They did not disappear. Instead, with the spread of the explosion, she did not know which corner of the world they had drifted to. There was a black void under her feet. The coldness of the void was completely washed away by the energy of the stars in the chapter of creation. She was surrounded by warmth. Qin Weibai looked ahead. The nearest place in front of her was a dark planet, rotating around the nearest star. Qin Weibai vaguely understood something. Her so-called return and so-called awakening seemed to be a search. In the starry sky of the dream, she silently looked at the world in the dream. Countless galaxies, countless star clusters, and an almost eternal distance. What she wanted to do was to find Li Tianlan's phantom again in this world, find that tree, and find that garden. They still existed. They existed in a corner of a planet in a galaxy of a star cluster in this world of the dream. Maybe when she saw Li Tianlan again, their consciousness could be completely synchronized. And such a search was equivalent to looking for a certain elementary particle in a gravel in the endless universe. The most important thing was, how could she cross this seemingly endless distance? She needed tools. She needed a spaceship. A thought flashed through Qin Weibai's mind subconsciously. She wanted a spaceship at this moment. The space was shaking. Without any warning, a huge ram appeared in Qin Weibai's field of vision. Then, a majestic starry sky warship appeared silently in front of Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai looked at the scene in front of her with a dull face. She could clearly feel that this spaceship appeared in her dream with her thoughts. That feeling was so appropriate, and there was nothing strange about it. Qin Weibai had no idea what kind of technology and materials were needed to build a spaceship. But as she imagined, this spaceship really appeared. It should be a flying saucer. Qin Weibai continued to think about some UFO images that were circulating in various countries. So the huge battleship kept changing and finally became a flying saucer in line with Qin Weibai's expectations. I need to be faster, Qin Weibai murmured to herself. No, the fastest. The flying saucer disappeared without any warning. Without any warning, it completely disappeared from Qin Weibai's sight. The corner of Qin Weibai's mouth twitched subconsciously. In her consciousness, there seemed to be something flying through the starry sky at a speed far faster than the speed of light. She knew it was the flying saucer. It flew away. The point was that it didn't take her with it. One flying saucer is not enough, Qin Weibai continued to think. As she thought, endless flying saucers began to appear without warning. They occupied Qin Weibai's vision and almost covered the entire starry sky that Qin Weibai could see in an instant. Countless flying saucers moved in different directions in Qin Weibai's mind, forming one fleet after another. Qin Weibai's eyes were shining, and she was in high spirits. She finally discovered what kind of ability she had in this dream. This was her dream. In her dream, she couldn't find Li Tianlan, but under most conditions, she had almost omnipotent ability. And such an ability, if explained in the most straightforward way, was not difficult. There was a word that could perfectly explain this ability. This word. It was called dream come true. Chapter 1093. The closer it was to the Spring Festival, the colder it got in Zhongzhou State. It was said that this year's cold wave was extremely rare in Zhongzhou State for decades. The cold wave went all the way south from Snow Country, swept through the northeast of Zhongzhou State, swept through Yuzhou, and again swept through most of Dongshan and Yan and Zhao with heavy rain and snow. In the places with the heaviest rain and snow, there was even a small-scale snow disaster. The snowstorm in Qingzhou was neither too heavy nor too light. The snowflakes drifted lazily in the sky, and the spotless white dots dotted the entire city. When night fell, the drifting snowflakes in the sky looked a little cold under the lights of the city, but it was also beautiful. I'm really defeated by this damn weather. I'm freezing to death. At the headquarters of Plain Trading, Hishui muttered helplessly as he walked out of the elevator when it was time to get off work. Silver high-heeled shoes, black cotton stockings, leather shorts, and a white tight-fitting sweater wrapped around her exquisite figure. As the president of Plain Trading, He-Shui perfectly interpreted the unique charm of a mature woman. When she went out, got in the car, got out of the car, and entered the company, she hated being fat the most. So even in the snowy weather of -5 or 6 degrees, she still wore thin clothes. It was fine at home and in the company, but the short distance from the lobby to the parking lot after she got out of the elevator was the most unbearable. "You're wearing too little." In the gentle and light voice, the woman walking beside He-Shui showed a very charming smile on her face. She was dressed much more plainly than all the female employees of Plain Trading. She wore a white extended down jacket and sneakers that were not sexy but very comfortable. Her hair was tied up casually, and she wore no makeup. She was so pure as if she had not been contaminated by the glitz and dust of the city at all. When she approached the door of the lobby, the cold wind whistled. She put on the hood of the down jacket, covering most of her beautiful face. She turned around to look at He-Shui. He-Shui had already put on a light-colored cashmere coat, but his body was still shivering. It was obvious that he was still extremely cold. "Do you want me to lend you my clothes?" She smiled softly. "Forget it, I can't afford it. If you catch a cold later, won't I be guilty?" He-Shui hugged her shoulders and laughed. "Let's go. Let's go to my house tonight. My parents said that they won't eat until you arrive. They've already picked up Tide." He-Shui pushed her slightly faster. The employees of Sushi Trading who hadn't had time to go home saw the two of them standing there. When they greeted Mr. He, they didn't forget to greet her, who was being pushed away by He-Shui. The way he addressed Manager Lee was filled with obvious intimacy and respect. She smiled in response to every employee who passed by her. Her smile was gentle, peaceful, and sincere. The two of them jogged into the parking lot one after another. A black Audi with an extremely eye-catching license plate, which did not have a powerful aura, was parked next to He-Shui's car. A young man who did not look aggressive at all and looked extremely honest greeted the two of them in a somewhat reserved manner. "President He, Manager Lee, Chairman He asked me to pick you up." Standing in front of Audi, the administrative manager of Plain Water Trading, Li Mutong, frowned slightly. Her face was covered by a hat, so her expression was a little blurry. However, He-Shui seemed to read her best friend's mind. She chuckled and said, "It's not like we don't have a car. We don't need him to be nice. You can go back. We'll drive straight away." Without waiting for the driver to reply, she opened the door of her car and stuffed Li Mutong in. Then, she smiled and sat in the driver's seat. The heater in the car was turned up to the maximum, and He-Shui calmed down for a while. She took off her coat again and looked at Li Mutong, who was silent in the passenger seat. Suddenly, she laughed and said, "Hey, you don't seem to be going to our house recently. Even if you do, you're in a hurry. My parents have asked me a few times whether you and Tong Tong have quarreled. Why doesn't Tong Tong bring little Tide to play anymore? From what I can see, they are much more attentive towards you than they are towards me. Miss, you haven't been going to our house recently. It's not because of my brother, right?" "No." Li Mutong smiled and said, "I made it clear to second brother He last time. I've always treated him as my brother." "Tut tut," He-Shui sighed softly. She wanted to say that her second brother's infatuation was pitiful, but thinking of Li Mutong's character, she hesitated and said nothing in the end. The He family was far from being a wealthy family in Zhongzhou State. Even in Dongshan, it couldn't be said to be a first-tier or second-tier wealthy family. But in a small city like Qingzhou, the He family was definitely one of the richest families. In He-Shui's generation, there were 3 siblings. The eldest brother's family had been overseas for a long time. He-Shui managed the family business, and the second brother, He-Hong, became the pillar of the He family. He-Hong's career was not very smooth before. But in the past 2 years, there were frequent personnel changes in Dongshan, which affected all the counties and cities. He-Hong took some action and seemed to be on the rise. More than 2 years ago, he was just a non-director and low-ranking deputy mayor of Qingzhou. 2 years ago, he coincidentally became a director of Qingzhou. About a month ago, he became the deputy speaker of Qingzhou. The mayor of Qingzhou was old and would probably retire tomorrow, so He Hong had a great chance to be promoted. Perhaps because of this, He Hong's uneasy heart seemed to have a little more confidence. About 3 months ago, when Li Mutong brought her daughter to his house, He Hong drank a little too much and expressed his feelings to Li Mutong in a very subtle way. He Shui was well aware of his second brother's feelings. When he was still the deputy mayor, he saw Li Mutong for the first time, and he was already deeply in love with her. He Hong was 39 years old this year. He had a marriage in his early years, but his wife died of illness 10 years ago and they didn't have any children. Perhaps because he missed his wife too much, He Hong had been alone for 10 years, and he had always taken good care of his wife's family. He Hong might have made mistakes during his more than 10 years of official career, but he had never violated the rules. He was not lustful for women, and he never had any scandals. The wealth from the water trade was also destined to keep him away from financial problems. He worked conscientiously, had a modest personality, and had an elegant demeanor. He might not be a perfect man, but no one could say that he was a gentleman, and no one could object to that. In He Shui's heart, his second brother was very simple in love. When he first met Li Mutong, he had been suppressing his love for her. He Shui had asked him the reason, and his answer was very honest. I'm so many years older than her, so it's not suitable for me. She might not like me. How should I put it? I like a girl like her very much, but I always feel that I don't deserve a girl like her. For more than 2 years, He Hong had been suppressing his feelings. Even when Li Mutong became a single mother, He Hong's attitude towards her didn't change at all. Instead, he secretly spent more time and effort on her. An orphan and a widowed mother. It was easy to imagine the difficulties that the mother and daughter had encountered in life. The He family had always guessed that Li Mutong was a daughter from a wealthy family. It was only because of her child that she had completely broken up with her family. Therefore, many times, even though she appeared to be very strong, her lack of social experience still made her somewhat distressed. He Hong watched silently and secretly blocked all the troubles for her without batting an eyelid. In the past 2 years, there were more than 10 outstanding young men who didn't mind her bringing her child to court her. He Hong didn't stop them. He only gave a warning to those who pestered and caused trouble for the mother and daughter. The situation in Dongshan in the past 2 years was extremely complicated. He Hong, who had an excellent reputation, slowly showed his brilliance. It wasn't until He Hong was sure that he had a bright future that he found a suitable opportunity to carefully and tactfully express his feelings to Li Mutong. However, the response he received was the same as the other suitors. Perhaps it was also different. Because Li Mutong was also very tactful. She said that she had always treated He Hong as her brother. But no matter what, in essence, her answer was still a rejection, and there was no room for negotiation. From then on, Li Mutong rarely went to the He family's door. Today was He Shui's mother's birthday. She tried her best to persuade Li Mutong, and even got her parents to bring little Tide to the He family's house in advance. Only then did she manage to convince Li Mutong to attend the He family's family dinner. If she still made fun of her second brother at this time, her best friend would probably get angry. He Shui treasured her bestie Li Mutong very much. It could even be said that she treasured her the most. She had never put in a good word for her second brother in front of her. It didn't matter whether Li Mutong was a daughter from a wealthy family or not. She knew one thing very clearly. Even if her second brother didn't mind that Li Mutong was a single mother, even if the entire He family including their parents were willing to accept them. But Li Mutong wouldn't accept it. The identity of Li Chaoxi's father had always been a mystery. This was Li Mutong's taboo. Every time He Shui brought it up indirectly, all he got was silence. At the beginning, the silence was fragile, lost, and even a little wronged. But the silence would slowly change as time went by. After 2 years of silence, Li Mutong didn't feel fragile and lost anymore. What was left was an extremely quiet and indifferent feeling. This Li Mutong was the most beautiful. As calm as still water. This Li Mutong was like waking up from an ancient painting. The clock forgot to sway, and the flowers forgot to bloom. She was so quiet, like a drop of ink in an ancient painting, so quiet that it wouldn't change for thousands of years. She waited quietly, and she persisted quietly. All the hustle and bustle had nothing to do with her. In the ordinary world, she bloomed peacefully, like a flower that didn't attract dust. He Ishui started the car. He sighed softly in his heart. Perhaps waiting for her daughter to grow up had become the biggest motivation for Li Mutong. But the insistence in her heart didn't show any sign of loosening. This insistence was so stubborn that it instinctively refused all the men to get close to her. That adorable child, that touch of lovesickness, seemed to have become her everything for the rest of her life unknowingly. The car slowly drove out of the parking lot. The wind and snow were flying in the night sky of Qingzhou. The new snow was bright, and the rest of her life was boundless. He Ishui was silent for a while, and then said softly, "Don't worry. Today's family dinner doesn't mean anything else. It's just that my mother misses you." Li Mutong was also quietly looking at the flying snow outside the car window. Her eyes were a little blurred. After a while, she softly answered. Chapter 1094. The snow danced in the wind. When the car entered an old villa area in Qingzhou, the villa area was already brightly lit. He Ishui put on his coat again and ran into a villa with Li Mutong in tow. As soon as he entered the door, he said with a trembling smile, "I'm freezing to death." The heater in the villa was on full blast. It was as warm as spring. An elderly couple who looked to be in their 60s were sitting on the sofa watching television. When they saw her daughter and Li Mutong enter, the graceful and kind old woman stood up with a smile. However, the first thing she said was not to greet her daughter. "Tong Tong, you're here. Sit and warm up for a while. Dinner will be served soon." Li Mutong smiled and greeted her aunt. She looked at the old man beside the old woman and greeted him uncle. The old man's hair was already a little white, and he looked like he had been through a lot. Although the He family was not big, the old man who founded the plain water trade when he was young was a legendary figure in Qingzhou. In his old age, there were traces of a lifetime of hard work on his face. The old man did not seem to care much about Li Mutong. He just nodded at her casually. All his thoughts were on the baby sitting in his arms. The baby who had just celebrated her first birthday was a girl. She had small hands and feet and wore pretty little clothes. She kept reaching out her little hands in the old man's arms, as if she wanted to grab the old man's beard. The old man smiled and dodged her. From time to time, he would carefully pinch the girl's little face. The little girl seemed to be a little angry. She opened her little mouth and wanted to bite the old man's finger. The old man laughed out loud, and even his eyes narrowed. Li Mutong looked at this scene with a smile. She reached out her hands and said gently, "Tide, come, mommy will carry you." The girl turned her head in the old man's arms. When she saw her mother, she struggled to get down from the old man's arms. The old man laughed and scolded, "Little girl, you only know how to look for your mommy. Did you forget that grandpa fed you delicious food just now?" The girl ignored him. She opened her little hands and called her mommy softly with a tender and cute voice. Li Mutong seemed to melt into this tender voice. She squatted down and opened her hands slightly. The girl climbed down from the old man's knees and walked to Li Mutong with a little stagger. She fell into her arms. "Uncle, auntie, I'm sorry for the trouble." Li Mutong carried her daughter and looked apologetic. "What words?" The old man smiled and waved his hand. "Tong Tong, don't say that. You don't treat us as family. You haven't been coming here often, and your aunt has been talking about little Tide. There were a few times when she couldn't help but want to see it. I was afraid that you would be annoyed, so I kept stopping her." The old man's name was very compatible with Qingzhou City. His name was He Qingzhou. His life of more than 60 years could be considered bumpy and full of ups and downs. In the end, he had relatively good achievements. The old couple was very satisfied with their current life, but what made He Qingzhou most regretful was the problem of the family's heirs. 2 sons and a daughter. His eldest son had a happy family, but he was abroad all year round, so He Qingzhou didn't see him often. The second son's family used to be quite good, but his daughter-in-law passed away early and didn't leave behind any children. As for his daughter, he didn't have high hopes for his son-in-law when he first got married. As expected, they divorced after a few years of marriage. They also didn't have any children. In such a big villa, it was better at night. During the day, when the children went to work, only the old couple and the servants were left in the house. It was cold and indescribably boring. As for Li Mutong, the old couple was very fond of her. This child was generous and quiet, and she had a peace and quiet that stood aloof from worldly affairs. She was also very capable in her work. Now, although her position was only the administrative manager of plain water trading, her salary was actually comparable to that of the company's vice president. If it wasn't for her resistance to promotion, He Shui even wanted to promote her to vice president. At the very least, she couldn't escape from the position of assistant to the president and director of a department. He Qingzhou and his wife loved Li Mutong almost as if she was their own daughter. Even though they knew that she didn't get pregnant before. Now that they had Li Mutong, who was not their biological daughter, their love life was also bumpy. The old couple didn't know how to feel. Madam He even hated Tide's bastard father to the core. Whenever she talked about him, she would be filled with anger. However, when she faced Li Mutong, she felt even more pity for her. During the year after Li Mutong's pregnancy and postpartum, although they hired a nanny, Madam He would always run to Li Mutong's place and take care of her meticulously. It was also during this process that Li Mutong seemed to have slowly integrated into the He family. Li Mutong looked at the smiling old lady beside her and chuckled. "Auntie, happy birthday. I've prepared a gift for you. I'll give it to you during dinner." "You child, don't be so polite. The fact that you're here is the best gift." The old lady pulled Li Mutong to her side and smiled. She seemed to have thought of something and lowered her voice. "Silly girl, if you feel wronged in the future, just tell me, okay? I've scolded your second brother harshly. If he says anything else, just tell me and I'll scold him for you. Little Tide is my and your uncle's baby now. We're feeling empty after not seeing her for so long. You can't be so distant. If that's the case." He Qingzhou nodded and smiled. Yihong is so impatient and doesn't know his limits. Tong Tong, uncle and auntie will stand up for you. If we don't like him, we don't like him. It's okay if you don't become our daughter-in-law. We're family. If you don't bring little Tide to our house in the future, we'll be angry. You hate Yihong, but you can't be disdainful of us too, right? That's not what I mean. Li Mutong shook her head and smiled softly. I don't hate second brother, but I've always seen him as an older brother. I don't have any other thoughts, and I don't want to think about that. The only thing I want now is to raise Tide successfully. Okay. He Qingzhou nodded with a smile. They really didn't have any other thoughts. They were very satisfied with Li Mutong, and they liked Li Chaoshi from the bottom of their hearts. If Li Chaoshi could become their daughter-in-law, they would agree with both hands and feet. But they didn't have that fate, so there was no need to force it. The He family of Qingzhou wasn't a rich family, but not every rich family could be so magnanimous. Let's not talk about this. Today is your auntie's birthday, and she made a lot of dishes. Eat more later. We won't drink for a family banquet. He Qingzhou smiled and looked at his daughter. Call your second brother and ask him why he's not back yet. Only now do you remember me? I thought you'd forgotten about your daughter. He Shui, who had been teasing Li Chaoshi, said unhappily. He took out his phone and dialed He Yihong's number. The call went through quickly, but the other side of the phone only said a few words before the call was hung up. He Ishui frowned slightly and was silent for a while. What's wrong? He Qingzhou asked casually. Second brother said that there's an emergency council meeting in the city. I'm afraid he won't be back until very late today. He Ishui said slowly. He Qingzhou's expression changed. He frowned slightly, but he didn't say anything. The atmosphere in the villa suddenly became tense. Li Mutong hugged her daughter and patted her back gently. The child was lying on her shoulder obediently. She seemed to be having a good time in the afternoon, and now she was showing signs of falling asleep. Is it because of me? Second brother. Li Mutong felt that the atmosphere was not right, so she said with a smile. She remembered He Hong's driver in the parking lot of Plain Water Trade. Everything seemed to be a coincidence. Ignore him. We'll eat by ourselves. The old madam snorted and patted Li Mutong's head with a smile. It's not like that. He Qingzhou shook his head solemnly and sighed. It seemed that he was afraid that Li Mutong would misunderstand. He smiled again and looked at her. Tong Tong, don't think too much. It's really not like that. We're all family. Let me make it clear. From this year to next year, not only Qingzhou, but the entire East Mountain, the situation is very complicated. He raised a finger and pointed up. The fight at the top is fierce. I know. They have to prepare to take over. He Ishui added. He Qingzhou smiled and shook his head. At their level, it was impossible to come into contact with the real news at the top. He Hong, the deputy speaker of Qingzhou, couldn't. He Qingzhou couldn't, and He Ishui couldn't. But taking over, He Qingzhou shook his head subconsciously. He really couldn't see the situation at the top, but he also knew that it was very likely not the case. Although he wasn't sure that Li Huaqing would be re-elected, at least he could see that there seemed to be no strong person who had the possibility of reaching the top. It was already December. In the extremely special meeting some time ago, no strong person was elected as the deputy minister of the military. It seemed to indicate something very clear. Taking over seems to be unlikely. He Qingzhou shook his head. But you saw the news today. The prime minister's death. As he spoke, he shook his head and didn't finish his sentence. He seemed to be keeping this topic a secret. He Ishui was startled. She widened her eyes in astonishment. Dad, are you serious? Are you saying? I didn't say anything. He Qingzhou glared at her. He Ishui was silent for a while before saying softly, the prime minister died of a cerebral hemorrhage. It was announced this afternoon. There's nothing strange about it. He Qingzhou couldn't help but laugh. If you could see something strange about it, would you still be here? He Ishui frowned and said softly, Dad, are you saying that there are other reasons for the prime minister's death? Then isn't second brother. He Hong was very close to the governor of East Mountain. This was also the reason why he had been promoted in the past 2 years. The current governor of East Mountain had once served as the deputy governor of the Southwest Province. He could be said to be Chen Fengqing's old subordinate in the past. If the cause of the prime minister's death, He Ishui took a deep breath and shook his head subconsciously. How is this possible? Who has the guts to do that? I don't believe it. What does it matter if we believe it or not? Let's see what happens next. In the past 2 years, there have been a lot of changes in personnel in Zhongzhou State. We can't see through the mystery, but I think the southeast and the central plains have been severely suppressed. Now, you know Tiannan, right? He Ishui nodded subconsciously. I heard that Xianyuan city is very beautiful, but I haven't been there. Li Mutong's body trembled slightly. He subconsciously hugged his daughter and didn't speak. Tiannan, Xianyuan city, He Qingzhou laughed self-deprecatingly. It is said that the young big shot in Tiannan is going to show his strength before the election. It seems that he has always had a bad relationship with the prime minister. This time, who can say for sure? Once that person makes a move, it will affect all aspects. Qingzhou seems to be very big, but in his eyes, let alone Qingzhou, the whole East Mountain may be directly taken over by him. This is what it means to make waves with one turn of the hand. Your second brother is in a difficult situation now. The hall fell into silence for a while. Wang Yuedong's eyes were a little absent-minded. After more than 2 years, in this small town where it was impossible to get too much information from the upper class, she heard news about him again. He was the only man she had. He was the biological father of little Tide. She stood stiffly in the warm hall, in a daze. For a moment, she seemed to have lost her soul. I have other things to do these 2 days, so I don't have much time to write. Originally, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, the 3 chapters should be a big chapter of more than 10,000 words. I have no choice but to write them separately. Chapter 1095. After dinner, the snow in Qingzhou became heavier. The entire community was covered with snow. Li Chaoxi had fallen asleep in Li Mudong's arms. He Yishui picked up a small piece of cake and put it into his mouth. He looked at Li Mudong, who was chatting with his mother, and smiled. Don't leave tonight. It's so late and it's snowing heavily. I think it's frozen outside. Okay. Mrs. He nodded with a smile. Tong Tong, stay here. We can talk tonight. It's convenient for you to go to work with Yishui tomorrow. Let Chaoxi play with me for a day. I can't get enough of this little girl. If I go to work with her, I'll be at least half a day late. Li Mudong looked at He Yishui with a smile. She didn't object. In the past 2 years, she had been really familiar with He Yishui. She had lived here for half a year before and after childbirth. It's my own business. What are you afraid of? Who dares to deduct my salary? Just tell me and I'll help you. Mrs. He smiled and asked the nanny to clean up the room. She specially asked the nanny to put a new quilt on the crib. Wang Yuetong got up and followed her. She carefully put her sleeping daughter on the new crib and let the nanny take care of her. Then she returned to the living room. After the door was closed, the nanny bent down and pinched Li Chaoxi's little face lovingly. Then she turned around and found a new bag of milk powder and a bottle. Li Mudong often lived in He Yishui's house. The guest room next to He Yishui's bedroom had basically become Li Mudong's room. Therefore, there were many things in the room. After preparing the things that could comfort Li Chaoxi when she woke up, the nanny sat on a chair and turned on the TV in the room. She adjusted the volume to the lowest channel and continued to watch the TV series she was watching. The light from the TV was hazy. In silence, the little princess who was sleeping soundly frowned. At the center of her eyebrows, a 7-colored speck of light suddenly lit up. It was a speck of light that was smaller than a grain of rice. Normally, it would not be noticed at all. However, as the speck of light shone, a rainbow luster began to fluctuate between Li Chaoxi's brows. A weak but incomparably sharp light enveloped Li Chaoxi's petite body almost instantly. At the same time, a ray of pure white light began to distort and change in front of the crib, finally turning into an illusory figure shrouded in gentle light. The television in the room was still on. The nanny looked at the screen with relish, unaware of what was happening around her. Feng Qingwu lowered her head quietly and looked at Li Chaoxi, who was sleeping soundly with her arms spread open. Then, she looked at the blurry layer of light that enveloped her body and was stunned. The 7-colored radiance that was growing sharper and sharper silently calmed down. The light seemed to hesitate for a moment before it slowly retreated back into Li Chaoxi's forehead. Li Chaoxi stared deeply at the weak spot of light between the baby's eyebrows, a little dazed. In the ancient bronze hall in the space-time corridor, when His Majesty said that doomsday was coming, she felt that her escape route was here. She knew of Li Chaoxi's existence. She knew it the moment Li Chaoxi was born. She used to be the youngest daughter of the first His Majesty. And now, Li Chaoxi was the eldest daughter of Li Tianlan. Somehow, there was already some kind of connection between them. But now, when she saw the spot of light between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows, she finally understood how perfect her escape route was. Tens of thousands of years ago, or even longer, this spot of light had appeared on her forehead. It only disappeared when she reached the peak. To a certain extent, Feng Qingwu's achievements today had a lot to do with this spot of light. This was the mark of King Wei. He had reincarnated several times, and it had been a long time since then. It was hard to tell where King Wei had come from. When countless lost memories could no longer be found, perhaps even His Majesty in the corridor of time and space would not remember how King Wei had appeared. But there was no doubt that in the beginning, King Wei was one of the most important cornerstones of the entire neutral camp. What was a cornerstone? The so-called cornerstone was the power that could support all the paths of the entire camp. King Wei was the head of the 4 divine artifacts in the spacetime corridor. It was more important than the picture of all worlds, the Tower of Human Emperor, and the Shenyuan sword. No one could remember what King Wei was called in the beginning. According to vague records, the title of King Wei was bestowed by the first His Majesty, who was also Feng Qingwu's father, and it was unanimously recognized by all the major races of the neutral camp. In other words, King Wei was the King Wei of the neutral camp, and its title was recognized by all the forces of the neutral camp. In the spacetime corridor, the title represented more than just power and status. Behind each title was the accumulation of the fate of the human race and the countless races of the neutral camp. This was one of the most important powers of the human race. In the blasphemy war that lasted for nearly 1,000 years, His Majesty in the spacetime corridor used the Shenyuan sword as his weapon, transforming the endless fate of the human race into a sharp blade that covered the sky and killed the demons of the Order camp with one strike. To a certain extent, this was a display of his power to the extreme. King Wei was the cornerstone of the camp, and with the addition of the title, its mark naturally had an extraordinary significance. The light up between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows was the mark of King Wei, and it was also the mark that had appeared on Feng Qingwu's eyebrows. This mark had a name that everyone in the spacetime corridor envied. It was called the neutral halo. The neutral halo was connected to the host's bloodline, and even had a deep connection to the host's soul. To the creatures of the other camp, this was a heavenly punishment that was difficult to escape, but to the creatures of the neutral camp, it was a gift from the gods that they dreamed of. This was something that was extremely rare in the entire spacetime corridor. The effect of the so-called neutral halo was also clear and domineering. It greatly increased one's talent, physical quality, and luck. The so-called neutral halo, if translated into a term that everyone in Miracle City could understand, could also be called a halo. The protagonist halo. This was the real protagonist halo. The formation of similar halos required a cornerstone figure in the camp to separate a wisp of his soul with his own providence. But how many cornerstone characters were there in the entire spacetime corridor? King Wei was not yet complete. To separate and form a neutral halo, he would have to pay a huge price. It was clear that he favored Li Chaoxi, and even spoiled him. What an enviable little guy. Feng Qingwu tapped Li Chaoxi's eyebrows and smiled. A strand of 7-colored radiance twined around Feng Qingwu's fingertip and fused into her flesh. Feng Qingwu's shadow became more and more illusory, almost completely transparent. Big sister will be staying here for a long time. From now on, it is me, and I will be you. When you reach my level, we can only separate. Little Tide, do you agree? Feng Qingwu froze. She looked at the baby's face and asked softly. Little Tide, who was sleeping soundly, moved her little mouth. She stuck her little finger into her mouth and sucked on it. Big sister, take it as a yes. Feng Qingwu smiled. She glanced at the dot of light between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows and asked softly, "What does King Wei think?" The dot of light flickered silently. Feng Qingwu could vaguely feel a part of the energy from the dot of light fly out from between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows, pass through the villa, fly into the night sky, and float in the direction of Serenity Province. Feng Qingwu silently felt all this. After a while, she reached out her hand and touched Li Chaoxi's eyebrows. An illusory ray of light that seemed like it would dissipate at any moment blossomed between her fingers, slowly landing on the tiny dot of light. The dot of light began to shine, and the rainbow light slowly wrapped around the illusory light. Feng Qingwu pursed her lips and smiled, then said softly, "I can't stay here yet. I'll reserve a place first. That way, even if I die in the final war, I can still return here and embark on the path of return." She bowed slightly to the dot of light and said softly, "Thank you, Uncle King Wei." The rainbow light flashed on Li Chaoxi's forehead, illuminating her small body. Feng Qingwu touched Li Chaoxi's little hand again and smiled, "Thank you too, little sister, or little sister." Li Chaoxi turned over. Under the dim light, as he turned over, a shadow appeared on the wall. But it was not Li Chaoxi's shadow. Instead, it was a slender, hazy, and dreamy figure. That was Feng Qingwu's shadow. Feng Qingwu, who left her shadow on Li Chaoxi, looked through the snow outside the window and looked at the night sky. Her gaze seemed to have traversed an unimaginable distance in an instant, and she saw the battlefield once again. Just like what His Majesty had said. The human race no longer had a big picture. In the countless galaxies and galaxies that could be clearly seen, wars were erupting everywhere. Billions of interstellar fleets roared and roared. Battlefields covered the starry sky, the planets, the heavens, and the earth. It was not in a certain region. It was in the entire galaxy. The black ocean swept through hundreds of battlefields, bringing with it a monstrous sword light that charged forward on countless battlefields that were measured in units of light years. That dot of golden blood burned in the void, emitting a light that could shatter the starry sky, tearing apart battlefields one after another. Everything had come to an end. It was not only because of Li Tianlan's awakening. It was also because they had developed to the extreme. If they could not break through this bottleneck, what awaited them was an inevitable end. Feng Qingwu lowered her head, no longer looking at the battlefields that covered the starry sky. Because everything was meaningless. She would not make a move. Just like how the human emperor of the human emperor palace would not make a move. It was really meaningless. Silence was only a choice. Fighting was also a choice. The so-called hope of victory had long been smashed into despair in the illusory reality. Therefore, whether it was persisting in fighting or remaining silent, it had become a choice. This was the only power they had. It was also the power that everyone had always had. At least, they could choose how to die. Chapter 1096. The navigation system had failed, and the guide equipment had also failed half an hour ago. There was no mobile phone signal. For the rest of the journey, he could only rely on an ancient and primitive hand-drawn map to guide the way. There were dense trees and bushes that were enough to block the sun everywhere. Dozens of rare and highly poisonous creatures had been seen in just half a day, and this was the reason why he didn't deliberately look for them. The sense of direction could almost only be maintained by memory. Gu Xingyun stood in the extremely dense primeval forest and checked the hand-drawn map in his hand for a long time before he was sure that he should continue moving forward. The domain was mighty around him. Within a radius of more than 10 meters, any creature that bumped into the domain was completely crushed by it. Gu Xingyun walked forward, and his face became more and more cautious. This was an extremely ancient primeval forest in Nanyun, Zhongzhou State. It was not easy to distinguish the specific direction. Since entering this primeval forest 6 hours ago, Gu Xingyun had been rushing at full speed. Of course, his speed was not as fast as that of today's Li Tianlan, but he was an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. Even if he was injured, he had advanced nearly 300 kilometers in this primeval forest in 6 hours. This was already deep in the primeval forest. It deviated from any route, had no tourist attractions, and was inaccessible. Primitive and ancient, it was not in any development plan of Zhongzhou State at all. If he hadn't come in person, Gu Xingyun wouldn't even know that this deep mountain forest was so big. The distance of hundreds of kilometers was obviously not all of this forest. According to the description on the hand-drawn map, it was at least 60 kilometers to reach the destination. The map was given by Jiang Shangyu. Since the news of Chen Fangqing's death spread throughout Zhongzhou State 4 days ago, Jiang Shangyu finally completely convinced Li Guangtu, and the three parties cooperated. In 3 days, Gu Xingyun had made some arrangements for the plan of the Special Warfare Group. In theory, this cooperation could be achieved, but Gu Xingyun asked Jiang Shangyu to fulfill his promise first. So Gu Xingyun secretly came to Nanyuan after attending the farewell ceremony of Chen Fangqing's body yesterday. After confirming that his whereabouts had not attracted anyone's attention, he quietly entered this primeval forest. The destination was said to be a village. That was the place where he and Jiang Shangyu had agreed. Gu Xingyun was a little excited. He knew very well what it meant for him to be here, and he was looking forward to what would happen next. Because if Jiang Shangyu didn't lie, today or tomorrow, when he left this primeval forest again, the injury that he had recuperated for a few years would be completely healed, and his broken martial arts path would be extended in front of him again. In a short time, he might not be able to surpass the peak of the invincible realm and stand at the level of Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu. But according to Jiang Shangyu, if everything went well, when he left here, he would at least be a top expert at the peak of the invincible realm. Gu Xingyun had been close to the peak of the invincible realm many years ago. However, his talent was not really top-notch, and the martial arts inheritance of Kunlun City did not record the scenery of the peak of the invincible realm, so he had been stuck in this bottleneck for many years. It was not until he was attacked by Li Tianlan on the eve of the maneuver of the two academies a few years ago that he saw the outline of the peak of the invincible realm in the almost perfect martial arts sword intent. So in the past 2 years, Kunlun City had been restraining and forbearance. At that time, Gu Xingyun didn't care about the temporary silence of Kunlun City and the temporary shrinkage of the Special Warfare Group, because everything was temporary. From that time on, he had made up his mind that as long as his injury got better and he entered the peak of the invincible realm, he would kill Li Tianlan at all costs. It didn't matter even if he had to completely become enemies with the giant group and face the endless revenge of the Dongqing clan and the Samsara Palace. He wanted to kill Li Tianlan as soon as he entered the peak of the invincible realm at all costs. No one could stop him. But the fact slapped Gu Xingyun hard in the face. There was no need for the giant group to stop him at all. After the maneuver of the two academies, Li Tianlan grew at an incredible speed. He didn't really enter the invincible realm, but he already had the power that almost surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. When everyone was talking about Li Tianlan being the top expert in the dark world, Gu Xingyun panicked, but his biggest feeling was helplessness. He tried his best to stop Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace, but it had little effect. Time seemed to be completely on Li Tianlan's side. Until Li Tianlan went to Kunlun City. Gu Xingyun lost. It was a fiasco. Because of Li Tianlan, he saw the scenery after the peak of the invincible realm. At the same time, because of fighting with Li Tianlan, he overdrew his potential and cut off his path. There was a storm inside the Special Warfare Group. Almost every day, someone was investigated. In a short period of time, the Special Warfare Group had shrunk by nearly a third. Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace were like the sun at high noon. The Xingshi Group and Emperor Dong's palace merged perfectly without any awkwardness. The new group rose. Things were hitting Gu Xingyun's nerves one by one. That was the most desperate time for Gu Xingyun. That was the real despair. He knew very well what it meant. Perhaps Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace were temporarily attracted by Chen Fangqing, but Gu Xingyun could be sure that once Chen Fangqing couldn't stop Li Tianlan and fell down, he and the Special Warfare Group would fall after Chen Fangqing. At the most pessimistic time, he really planned to leave Zhongzhou State. Of course, he didn't go to Annan State. If he wanted to leave Zhongzhou State, there were many places to go. Star State, the European continent, and even some superpowers second only to Zhongzhou State in the world, such as Snow Country, extended an olive branch to him. Now there were few masters in the dark world. As the god of war of Zhongzhou state, even if his majesty was gone, he could go to any country and get the position of the god of war of that country and rebuild the order of the special warfare system. And those countries also came up with a relatively perfect plan. Compared with the seemingly generous promise of Annan State, Star State, England, France, Germany, and Snow Country all put forward almost perfect plans. They invited Gu Xingyun to go to their country. He didn't need to take anything from Zhongzhou State. He just needed to take the Gu family's team there. As long as they could land safely, they would negotiate with Zhongzhou State. This could be said to be a negotiation, and the conditions were so generous that Zhongzhou State could offer them casually. How important was a god of war who controlled the special warfare system? The special warfare system. It was no exaggeration to say that it was the order of a country in the dark. It can look loose, it can even look chaotic, but whatever, no matter what, it must be under control. The aftermath caused by the chaos in Snow Country had not completely subsided. Instead, it had become more and more intense. Most of the Invincible Realm experts on the Divine and Holy lists had fallen, and all the superpowers were leaderless. With no one in control of the situation, the order of the Dark World had completely collapsed. In some places, gangs, drug dealers, and killers began to emerge one after another. The crime rate skyrocketed, and all kinds of fights for interests took place every day. The chaos was not only spreading in the dark, but also on the surface. As time went by, no one knew how the situation would develop. Why could the Purgatory of Heaven capital and the current Emperor Dong's palace enter East Island? The royal family might not really welcome them to take root in East Island. But relatively speaking, they couldn't lose the order in the dark. So even if the person who controlled the order was not their favorite, or even hated, they would accept it if they had no other choice. After the chaos in Snow Country, Gu Xingyun could be said to be one of the top experts in the Dark World. Everyone knew his current situation, so all the invitations to him were full of sincerity. According to Gu Xingyun's speculation, if he joined those powerful countries, this matter might really turn around. As long as those people met the conditions of Zhongzhou State, he and the Gu family had the possibility to continue to exist. But this was only for Zhongzhou State. Gu Xingyun was not afraid of Zhongzhou State. It was Li Tianlan. It had always been Li Tianlan. Run? That was not realistic at all. If he stayed in Zhongzhou State, Li Tianlan might restrain himself. But once he left Zhongzhou State, even if he was temporarily safe, when Li Tianlan entered the Invincible Realm, where could he go? Even if he could run, how could the Gu family run? This was the most important reason why he had never made up his mind. If Jiang Shangyu hadn't taken the initiative to find him, he had even begun to consider the possibility of surrendering to Li Tianlan. Giving up the position of the war god of the state. Even giving up the leadership of the special warfare group. When there was really no turning back, groveling and begging Li Tianlan for mercy seemed to be the only feasible. This was also an important reason why he could accept Jiang Shangyu's proposal without difficulty. What Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu wanted was only 2/3 of the leadership of the special warfare group. After all, he could still keep 1/3 of his assets. As a condition of exchange, he didn't have to grovel and look at Li Tianlan's face. Jiang Shangyu could even make him really enter the peak of the Invincible Realm. It could even make him break through the peak of the Invincible Realm within a year or two, half a step into that supreme realm. What else did Gu Xingyun hesitate about? He directly agreed to cooperate. There were only some slight doubts in his heart. Jiang Shangyu had the example of going straight from the thunder-shocking realm to the half-step Invincible Realm overnight, and now he had the strength beyond the peak of the Invincible Realm. The iron-like fact made Gu Xingyun not have many doubts in his heart. The village deep in the forest was one of Jiang Shangyu's secret bases, and it also hid his biggest secret. And there was also the power that gave Gu Xingyun a new life. Gu Xingyun's heart was beating violently. He kept speeding up in the gradually quiet forest, identified the direction, and rushed directly to the destination. Chapter 1097. The forest was dense and deep. Gu Xingyun's speed changed from slow to fast, and finally from fast to slow. In the extremely dense primeval forest, he finally stopped where he was and looked around with a dignified look. Everything around him seemed to have changed. The world was quiet. The grass and trees were quiet. Gu Xingyun stood under a thick giant tree, frowning and looking around. He didn't speak for a long time. He didn't know why he always felt that there was something wrong around him, but he didn't know what was wrong. A master's will was as firm as iron. The more powerful he was, the more he believed in his intuition. In the spiritual field, this was the subconscious. The uneasy intuition came from the subconscious. In his subjective consciousness, he couldn't find anything wrong, but it didn't mean that everything here was normal. It could only mean that he hadn't found anything abnormal yet. What on earth is wrong? Gu Xingyun focused his attention and looked around silently. The trees stood there quietly. There was no wind in the forest, not even any sound. The extreme silence with absolute weirdness made people feel more and more uneasy. It was as if everything around him had no life. The whole world seemed to be completely dead. Gu Xingyun's muscles gradually tightened. He didn't doubt the sincerity of Jiang Shangyu's cooperation with him. At least until now, he had never suspected that Jiang Shangyu wanted to hurt him. But the forest around him, which looked normal but extremely weird, made him feel more and more cold. Gu Xingyun didn't know why, but the fear deep in his heart began to spread little by little, making his whole body a little stiff. He took out the hand-drawn map again to confirm the location. It was less than 10 kilometers away from the destination. The direction was accurate. This also meant that he didn't go the wrong way. Then, what did this inexplicable feeling in front of him mean? Gu Xingyun stood there and hesitated for about half an hour. Then he slowly moved forward, step by step, and continued to move toward the destination. The forest seemed to be changing at any time, but it also seemed to be unchanged. The increasingly quiet atmosphere made Gu Xingyun feel that his breathing and heartbeat were extremely harsh. The sky seemed to be getting darker and darker. A drop of cold sweat dripped down Gu Xingyun's forehead and fell to the ground. Gu Xingyun walked carefully and subconsciously held his breath. The moment he held his breath, the ear-piercing sound seemed to have disappeared by a large margin. The incessant beating of his heart that was becoming more and more rapid seemed to have instantly turned into a deafening roar of thunder. Gu Xingyun's body froze in place. An unparalleled fear completely engulfed his will in an instant. He finally understood what was wrong. Silence. As they entered the forest, the environment became quieter and quieter. Several kilometers away, in the depths of the primeval forest, Gu Xingyun did not see any birds or beasts, not even a bug. This place was like a real land of death. Apart from himself, there were no other signs of life. The entire forest was extremely quiet. There were no living creatures, no wind, and even the branches and leaves of the surrounding trees did not move at all. It was as if everything had frozen here. It looked like a dense forest, but in fact, it was a tomb full of corpses. Gu Xingyun stared at the trees in front of him quietly. All the trees around him were extremely thick, but the trunks and leaves were faintly black. The straight trees twisted into exaggerated shapes without any rules. Such an obvious change began with a little distortion. Perhaps the trees were in this state of distortion from the moment he entered the forest, but the distortion was very small. After he entered the forest, it began to enlarge little by little, so that now, if he did not pay close attention, Gu Xingyun would even think that this extremely exaggerated and strange distortion was normal. And, the sunlight disappeared. Gu Xingyun could be sure that it was daytime. The forest might be dense, but there should be some subtle light here. But those lights had all disappeared at this time. It was dark all around. The forest of Nanyan seemed to have fallen into a cold winter, and the extremely cold temperature continued to spread in the increasingly thick darkness. Gu Xingyun concentrated on observing all the details around him. A hand fell on his shoulder without any warning. It penetrated his domain and even pinched his shoulder in a very friendly manner. Gu Xingyun, who was completely focused, jumped up almost in an instant. At the same time, his domain was extremely distorted, and the hand was directly thrown away from his shoulder. From the corner of his eyes, Gu Xingyun saw that it was a complete arm. The arm rotated in the air, and the slightly black blood kept dripping from the air. Where did the hand come from? This was a forest. Where did the hand come from? The problem was that there was no one here. Where did the hand come from? Gu Xingyun, who clearly felt that his shoulder was pinched, felt his heart beat wildly. Without any hesitation, he rushed directly to the place where the arm fell. The arm fell in a mass of vigorous grass. Gu Xingyun's figure followed closely. He stared at the grass carefully, as if he wanted to study the arm that did not look like a living person's. However, there was nothing in the bushes. There was no arm, no blood, only a dead branch that seemed to have been broken for a long time. Gu Xingyun looked at the grass in front of him and was silent for a long time. Was it his vision? Or, the arm had been taken away? Who was here? Gu Xingyun suddenly glanced around in a 360-degree manner. In his sight, in the dark forest, there were only extremely twisted trees that looked extremely painful and fallen. Those trees were quietly twisted, like pairs of eyes, with ferocious malice, staring at his every move. Gu Xingyun swallowed, and he began to step back. The feeling of uneasiness seemed to have broken through the limit of his heart. The destination for his breakthrough was not far away, but Gu Xingyun did not dare to go forward anyway. It was too strange here. Jiang Shangyu seemed to be too strange. He was ready to withdraw from the forest and go to the outside world to talk with Jiang Shangyu in detail. His retreat began to speed up, faster and faster. The dark, quiet, and twisted forest kept retreating. Gu Xingyun's domain was fully open, and he flew in the dark forest. But there was no light in front of him. Everything seemed to be getting darker and darker. Gu Xingyun ran wildly for nearly half an hour before he stopped. He was sure that he could see the sun half an hour ago. But now he was retreating, returning to the original place. But in the past half an hour, there was no sun in front of him, and the surroundings became darker and colder. The extreme silence made all his sounds become manic. His breathing was like a hurricane, and his heartbeat was like thunder. In such a quiet environment, Gu Xingyun could even hear the sound of his blood flowing in his body. It was the sound of the raging tide beating on the cliff like a tsunami. His face was pale, and he took out the map with a slight tremble. The flame bloomed in his hand. In the subtle light, he looked at the map in his hand quietly. Perhaps it was a psychological effect, but no matter how he looked at it, he felt that this seemingly ancient hand-drawn map was also revealing a kind of strange feeling. The flame flickered in the darkness. He carefully identified everything around him, and the more he looked, the colder his heart became. He retreated for nearly half an hour. But judging from the extremely complicated marks on the map, instead of being far away from the forest, he was moving deeper. So far, he seemed to be less than a kilometer away from the real destination. His palm was sticky, and it seemed that he was sweating a lot because of nervousness. Gu Xingyun held the map in one hand and wiped his chest with the other. A touch of incomparably mournful red appeared on the clothes on his chest, forming an extremely gloomy bloody handprint. Blood? His other hand that was holding the map was also becoming sticky. Gu Xingyun's heart almost stopped beating. Slowly, in the darkness, he lowered his head little by little and looked at the map in his hand. It was getting darker and darker. It was getting quieter and quieter. In the extremely low visibility, he could only vaguely see that he seemed to be carrying something in his hand. It was like a map, but it seemed to be much bigger than a map. The strong smell of blood spread in the darkness. He could clearly feel that the thick liquid was constantly flowing from the palm of his hand holding the map. Gu Xingyun's arm trembled slightly. Shaking, he flicked out another flame. The flame illuminated the darkness. At that moment, Gu Xingyun saw the map in his hand. His heart suddenly stopped for a moment, and then he threw out the map in his hand like crazy. In his hand, the map, which had become much larger, was a complete human skin. Warm blood flowed down from under the human skin. The human skin was soft, but the face was stubbornly raised, smiling at Gu Xingyun in an extremely strange way. Fuck. 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 Gu Xingyun covered his chest with one hand, and his eyes were wide open. The human skin that was thrown out fell on the tree. The trunk was instantly dyed red with blood. The thin layer of human skin smiled silently and strangely, moving quickly on the trunk. In just a second, Gu Xingyun felt dizzy, and the human skin had appeared upside down in front of him. Its body was hanging on the trunk closest to Gu Xingyun. Its head and feet were up, and the ferocious face full of blood was smiling at Gu Xingyun, while its empty eyes were staring at Gu Xingyun's eyes. His emotions seemed to have completely collapsed at this moment. Gu Xingyun was an expert of the invincible realm, and the war god of the nation. He had seen many opponents. But he had never seen this one. His emotions completely collapsed, and he suddenly broke out with all his strength. The domain spread in all directions. Regardless of anything else, he chose a direction at random and rushed over. The violent domain swept through the woods. The forest was quiet and deathly still. The darkness retreated frantically. Gu Xingyun moved forward at full speed. 1 minute? Half a minute? Or maybe it was just a few seconds. A familiar ray of sunshine suddenly appeared in front of him. Gu Xingyun, who was almost in tears, rushed directly to the sunshine in front of him without any hesitation. The next second, all the darkness suddenly faded. The forest also appeared behind him. He rushed out of a dark forest and fell down gracelessly. He landed on a relatively flat patch of grass. The sun shone down, but there was no temperature. It was pale and almost false. But it was light after all. Gu Xingyun completely relaxed, and he stared at the forest behind him. A dark forest was still staring at him quietly. The human skin did not rush out, either. Gu Xingyun breathed a sigh of relief. He took out a cigarette with trembling hands and lit it. He took a big puff and calmed his inner fear. He didn't even have time to think about what was going on. The light around him made him feel safe instinctively. He just wanted to get out of here now. He didn't even realize how abnormal the cold wind was around him in the warm winter of Nanyun. The cigarette was soon finished. Gu Xingyun stood up and calmed himself down. He had a fear of this forest from the bottom of his heart, so he kept his back to the back, stared at the direction of the forest, and slowly retreated. The grassland under his feet became flatter and flatter, and even the mottled old ground appeared. Gu Xingyun kept retreating until the back of his head touched something. Gu Xingyun's scalp went numb, and he suddenly turned around. In his sight, a lantern that he had hit was swaying and floating. What appeared in front of Gu Xingyun was a very old wooden door. The lantern was not hung directly above the door, but in the middle. On the pale lantern, a big word, "She," was written in red ink like blood. The white lantern and the red words made people feel uncomfortable no matter how they looked at it. Gu Xingyun carefully retreated for a distance, and then looked around. All he could see were white lanterns everywhere. The red word, "She," was everywhere. Old houses were neatly arranged on the street. Gu Xingyun seemed to be standing in the middle of the street. Gu Xingyun's heart began to sink, and it kept sinking. His face became pale, and there was no color at all. The cold wind between heaven and earth seemed to be more mournful. The sun seemed to be gradually dimming. Gu Xingyun looked at the surrounding environment in silence. Here was a village. To be exact. This was the hand-drawn map. No, it was marked on the human skin, destination. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.